Hey friends! Around 70% of viewers who watch my videos haven't subscribed yet. If you enjoy the content, please consider subscribing. It would truly mean a lot to me. Also, don't forget to hit the like button and share your thoughts in the comments. Your support helps the videos reach more people and really helps the channel grow. Thank you so much. Let me know in the comments which city or country are you watching from. The sun was dipping low when I found myself driving down a dirt road so narrow and rough it felt like the tires might just give up on me at any moment. The kind of road where the dust settles on your windshield thick enough to hide the whole world if you stopped moving for too long. I had no real destination, just a vague urge to get away from everything. Phones, people, noise. Somewhere in the middle of nowhere where time seemed to stretch thin and the sky opened wide with nothing but silence to fill the gaps. The landscape was flat for miles, broken up here and there by dry patches of wild grass, some scraggly bushes, and the occasional leaning tree that looked like it had been fighting windstorms for years. No houses, no power lines, no signs of life except the distant buzz of a lone insect or the occasional flutter of a bird overhead. I hadn't seen another vehicle in at least an hour, maybe more. The quiet was something I hadn't expected to feel so deeply. It wasn't peaceful or relaxing, just heavy. It felt like the earth was holding its breath. At some point, the dirt road gave way to a path that was barely wide enough for my truck. The tire tracks faded and overgrown in places. I kept going anyway. Part of me thought this might be stupid, but I didn't care. The air smelled different out here, dry, dusty, with a hint of something earthy and old. It was the kind of smell that you don't notice until you're away from everything else and then it hits you like a punch. The sun was almost gone when I finally pulled off the path and stopped beside an old, rusted metal gate. It stood crooked in the ground, with a weathered sign hanging from one hinge. The words were faded and half-peeling, but I could just make out the letters spelling private property. I paused for a moment, then climbed out of the truck. The ground beneath my boots was dry and cracked, scattered with small stones and dead leaves. The wind was picking up now, moving through the grass in waves, carrying a faint chill that hinted at the coming night. I looked around, trying to decide if I should turn back, but something made me walk past the gate and into the open field beyond. The land stretched out endlessly, rising and falling in gentle hills that disappeared into the darkening horizon. There was no path here, just open ground and the sky growing darker by the minute. I pulled my jacket tighter around me as the wind pushed harder, carrying the scent of damp earth from somewhere far off. The silence was almost overwhelming. No city hum, no barking dogs, no distant engines. Just the sound of the wind and the occasional snap of a twig underfoot. I walked slowly, careful not to trip on the uneven ground, feeling more alone than I had in a long time. My shadow stretched out long behind me, merging with the shadows of the sparse trees that dotted the field. After what felt like an hour but was probably closer to 30 minutes, I spotted something in the distance. A small cluster of buildings, barely visible against the darkening sky. I had no idea what they were, but I decided to head toward them. As I got closer, I could see they were old and abandoned, maybe once part of a farm or a small homestead. The paint was peeling off the wooden walls, windows were broken or missing, and the roofs sagged in places as if weighed down by years of neglect. The ground around the buildings was littered with rusted tools, old tires, and bits of scrap metal. I walked through the yard, careful to avoid broken glass and sharp metal pieces. The place had a strange stillness to it, like it had been frozen in time and left to decay slowly. I noticed an old pickup truck, half buried in weeds. Its once bright red paint faded to a dull rust color. I moved inside the largest building, which looked like it might have been the farmhouse. The floor creaked beneath my boots, and dust hung thick in the air. Light from the setting sun filtered through the broken windows, casting long shadows across the empty rooms. I could see the remnants of old furniture covered in dust and cobwebs, a rusted stove in the corner, and a cracked sink with no running water. Despite the decay, I felt a strange sense of calm here. This place had been someone's home once. People had lived and worked and dreamed here. Now it was just a shell slowly being reclaimed by nature. I sat down on the floor, leaning my back against the rough wooden wall, and let out a long breath I hadn't realized I was holding. The temperature was dropping quickly, and the wind outside had turned colder. I knew I couldn't stay here for long without proper shelter or a fire, so I got up and made my way back toward the truck, careful in the dark now, the last bit of light disappearing behind the hills. The night settled in fast, and the stars began to appear, thousands of tiny pinpricks of light scattered across a sky so clear it felt like I could reach out and touch them. I climbed into the driver's seat, started the engine, and pulled back onto the dirt path. The truck rumbled beneath me as I made my way back the way I came, the headlights cutting through the blackness. The dust rose again, swirling in the beams of light. The stillness was broken by the sound of the engine and the crunch of tires on the loose gravel. As I drove, the loneliness I had felt earlier began to fade, replaced by a sense of something different. Respect, maybe, for this land that held stories in its silence, for the people who once lived here and left their mark, for the way the world keeps moving even when you feel like you're standing still. I knew I was leaving something behind, but I was also carrying a part of it with me. By the time I reached the main road, the sky was completely dark. The headlights of passing cars were bright and noisy after the quiet of the open land. The towns and houses reappeared, and the world felt a little less vast. But I knew that stretch of emptiness would be there whenever I needed it. A place untouched, real and steady, in the middle of nowhere. And for now, that was enough. I set out early one morning, driving down a long, dusty road that seemed to stretch forever without a single sign of life or civilization. The sun was just beginning to rise, casting a soft orange light over the dry fields on either side. The road was cracked and uneven, with weeds pushing up through the edges like nature was slowly taking back what was once hers. My truck was old, rusty, and barely holding together, but it was the only way I could make this trip. I was headed somewhere I had never been before, a place so far off the map that it felt like I had disappeared from the world entirely. The air was dry and hot, carrying the faint smell of dust and something else I couldn't quite place. Maybe old wood or long-forgotten earth. The radio was silent except for static, and the only sound was the engine struggling against the rough terrain. I passed a few dead trees standing alone in empty fields, their branches twisted and bare, like skeletons left behind by some long-gone storm. Every few miles, I spotted a fence, falling apart and leaning over as if no one had cared for it in decades. Occasionally, a sign would appear warning of private property or something else, but most of the time the signs were faded and impossible to read. After driving for hours, the road became less defined, turning into a rough dirt path that shook the truck with every bump. I kept going because I had a destination in mind. A small cabin that was supposed to be tucked away in this wilderness, far from any town or neighbor. The promise of solitude was what brought me here, but as I went deeper, the quiet settled around me like a weight. The landscape changed slowly but surely. The flat fields gave way to rolling hills, covered in dry grass and scattered bushes. The sky stretched wide and empty above me, with no buildings or power lines to break the horizon. It was so quiet that even the usual sounds of birds or insects were missing. I felt a strange mix of calm and unease, like I was the only person left on Earth, but I didn't turn back. At one point, the truck caught on a patch of loose gravel and skidded for a few feet before I managed to stop. My heart was pounding from the sudden scare. I stepped out to check the tires and noticed something strange. Deep, fresh tire tracks beside mine, heading in the opposite direction. They looked like they belonged to a heavy vehicle, maybe a truck like mine. For a moment, I wondered if someone else had been here recently, but there was no other sign. No footprints, no discarded trash, nothing. I shook my head and got back into the truck, telling myself I was just imagining things. The last thing I wanted was to think about anyone else out here, especially since I had come for peace. The sun was climbing higher now, making the dust swirl in the air and turning everything a pale, washed-out color. Sweat ran down my back as I pushed the truck further along the path. Eventually, I saw it. A small wooden cabin nestled against a rise, partly hidden by some scraggly pine trees. It looked old but solid, with peeling paint and a crooked porch. The windows were dirty and dark, and the door hung slightly open. I parked the truck nearby and stepped out, the dry earth crunching under my boots. The cabin smelled like old wood and something faintly musty. Inside, dust covered every surface, and cobwebs clung to the corners. The floorboards creaked under my feet, and I noticed the remnants of old furniture. An armchair torn and stained, a small table covered in dust, and a rusted stove in the corner. It looked like no one had been here for a long time. I explored carefully, checking the back of the cabin where I found a small shed. It was locked, but the door was weak and I managed to pry it open. Inside were tools, an old gas can, and some canned food that looked like it had expired years ago. There was a sense of abandonment everywhere, but also something else, an odd feeling that someone had left in a hurry. I sat down on the porch, looking out over the hills. The wind had picked up and was blowing dry leaves and dirt around. I felt alone but not lonely. I had wanted this time away from the noise and the endless rush of the city. But now, in the middle of nowhere, the silence felt heavy, like it was pressing down on me. The afternoon passed slowly. I explored a bit around the cabin, finding an old fire pit ringed with stones and some broken glass bottles. The ground was cracked and hard, and the grass was brittle under my feet. I could see the path I had come down, winding away like a thin ribbon disappearing into the hills. No signs of life, no other vehicles, nothing. As evening came, the temperature dropped quickly. The sky turned a deep purple, and stars began to twinkle one by one. I started a small fire in the pit, using dry wood from nearby bushes. The flames crackled and popped, casting flickering shadows on the cabin walls. The fire felt comforting, a tiny barrier against the vast, empty dark beyond. I stayed by the fire for hours, watching the stars move slowly across the sky. The quiet was complete, and I could hear my own breathing and the crackle of the fire. I thought about how far I had come, the long hours of driving, and how this place was as close to true isolation as I had ever experienced. Eventually, the cold became too much and I went inside to sleep. I set up a small cot I found in the corner and wrapped myself in an old blanket. The night was deep and still, with only the faint sound of wind outside. I felt strangely at peace despite the loneliness. When morning came, I packed my things slowly. I took one last look around the cabin, feeling a strange connection to the place. It was harsh and empty, but it was real. No tricks, no stories, just a quiet spot far from everything. I started the truck and began the slow drive back. The sun was warm and bright, and the world seemed to wake up around me. Birds chirped, and the wind carried fresh scents of pine and earth. The road was still rough, but I felt stronger, like the time I spent out there had cleared something inside me. As I drove back toward the nearest town, I knew I would remember this place. Not for any strange happenings or stories, but because it was a reminder that sometimes, being truly alone with nature, away from noise and people, could be exactly what you need. No illusions, no fantasy. Just the raw, quiet truth of being in the middle of nowhere. And that was enough. The sun was just dipping below the horizon when I realized how far from anywhere I really was. The road I had been following was little more than a dirt track, dusty and lined with tall, dry grass that brushed against the sides of my truck. I had no real plan when I left town earlier that day, just a need to get away from the noise, the people, and the endless hum of life that had been suffocating me. I wanted to be somewhere where the only sounds were the wind and the rustling of the trees. Somewhere quiet, somewhere empty. The air was thick with the smell of dry earth and pine needles. The sun's last light turned everything a soft, orange-gold color that made the shadows stretch long and thin across the land. I could feel the cool creeping in, the kind that comes just before dark when the heat of the day fades but the night hasn't fully settled yet. The kind that makes your skin prickly and your breath a little visible. I pulled off the dirt road onto a narrow path that seemed less traveled, barely wide enough for my truck. It led into the woods, where the trees crowded closer together, their branches twisting and clawing at the sky. I wasn't sure why I turned down this path. There was no sign of a cabin or a campsite, no lights or smoke to guide me, just the thick, silent forest. But I was tired, and the truck needed a break. I figured I could stop for a while, get some rest, and decide where to go in the morning. I parked beneath a large pine tree and climbed out. The ground was soft beneath my boots, covered in a layer of pine needles that muffled my steps. The silence was overwhelming. No cars, no people, no dogs barking in the distance. Only the occasional call of a bird settling in for the night. The sky above was a deepening blue, with stars beginning to peek through the gaps in the trees. I sat on the tailgate, looking out into the darkness beyond the edge of the clearing. I felt a strange mix of peace and unease. Being so isolated made me feel small, like the world was much bigger and wilder than I usually let myself think about. But at the same time, there was comfort in the quiet, a break from everything that chased me back in town. After a while, I decided to make a fire. I gathered some dry wood from around the base of the trees, careful to pick only what was dead and lying on the ground. The pine needles smelled sharp and resinous as I crushed them in my hands to use as kindling. The first sparks caught quickly, and soon a small fire crackled and danced, casting flickering shadows on the trees around me. I sat close to the fire, feeling the heat seep into my chilled skin. The flames cast a warm glow on the rough bark of the trees and the rocks scattered around the clearing. The fire's light seemed to push back the darkness, but only just. The woods beyond the glow looked black and endless, full of shapes and noises I couldn't quite place. As the night deepened, the temperature dropped sharply. The wind picked up, whispering through the branches and causing the fire to flare and sputter. I wrapped my jacket tighter around me, thankful for its thickness. My mind wandered back to the reason I had come here, the things I was trying to escape. Life had felt like a constant weight on my shoulders, full of problems that seemed too big to solve. Here, in this quiet corner of the world, those problems felt distant, smaller, but the peace was fragile. I noticed how quickly the dark could swallow everything. The stars were bright and cold above, but they offered no real light on the ground. I couldn't see more than a few feet beyond the fire's reach. The silence, once comforting, now pressed in on me. It made me aware of every sound. The crack of a twig somewhere deep in the woods, the low rustle of animals moving unseen, the soft rush of wind. I tried to focus on the fire and the steady rhythm of my breathing. I thought about sleep, but the cold and the unfamiliar noises kept me awake. I stayed alert, knowing how easy it could be to get lost or caught off guard out here. Hours passed. The fire burned low, the heat fading until I had to gather more wood. Each time I moved, the shadows shifted, and I saw shapes in the darkness that vanished when I blinked. My heart beat faster, not out of fear but out of a strange, raw awareness. This place was real and alive, indifferent to me and my worries. Eventually, the cold became too much. I wrapped myself in a blanket I had brought and settled in the back of the truck. The cabin warmed by a small heater I managed to keep running on battery power. I lay back and stared at the roof, hearing the quiet sounds of the night outside. The wind, the distant calls of animals, the gentle creak of the trees moving. Sleep came slowly, but when it did, it was deep and dreamless. I woke before dawn, the first pale light filtering through the trees. The air was crisp and fresh, filled with the scent of pine and earth. I stepped outside to watch the sun rise, painting the sky with soft pinks and blues. The world felt new and clean, like a fresh start. I packed up slowly, taking one last look at the clearing, the fire pit now cold and ashen. I realized that being alone here had given me something important. Not answers exactly, but a kind of clarity. Life was still complicated, and problems still waited back in town. But this quiet place had reminded me that I could step away when things got too loud. That sometimes, just being still and alone was enough to find a little peace. I drove back to the dirt road and then to the highway, the sun climbing higher with each mile. The world was waking up again. Cars, people, noise, but I carried a calm with me that I hadn't had before. I knew I could come back to this middle of nowhere whenever I needed to remember what it felt like to be alone, to be quiet, and to just breathe. And that was enough. The sun was just starting to dip behind the tall trees when I found myself deep in the middle of nowhere. A place where roads turned into dirt paths and cell service was a distant memory. I had taken a wrong turn hours ago while driving through the back roads, aiming to find a shortcut to my destination. Instead, I ended up far off the map, surrounded by nothing but thick woods and an endless sky. The air smelled heavy with pine and damp earth, and the fading light made the shadows stretch long and strange. The dirt road I had been following had turned narrow and uneven. Tire tracks were faint, as if few vehicles passed this way, and I could hear the quiet sounds of the forest waking up for the night. Somewhere nearby, a bird called out sharply before silence returned. I realized then that I hadn't seen another person since I'd taken that last turn hours earlier. I stopped the car and stepped outside. The ground was soft and slightly muddy from recent rain, and the cool air brushed against my skin. Around me, trees stood tall and thick, their trunks covered in moss and bark rough under my fingertips. The sky overhead was clear, the first stars beginning to peek through the darkening blue. There was a stillness here I had never experienced before, a kind of quiet that wasn't empty but full of the life that existed without human noise. I decided to keep going on foot. The road was no longer reliable for driving, with deep ruts and rocks scattered across it. My car was an old model, and I was worried about getting stuck. I grabbed my small backpack from the passenger seat, which had a water bottle, a flashlight, some snacks, and a thin jacket. I locked the doors behind me and started walking slowly along the path. The dirt crunched under my boots, and the cool air filled my lungs with every breath. As I moved deeper into the woods, I noticed how different everything looked up close. Tiny insects crawled on fallen leaves, and the ground was dotted with small mushrooms and wildflowers. Here and there, broken branches lay scattered, evidence of animals moving about unseen. Hours seemed to pass, though I wasn't sure. The light was fading faster than I expected. I found a small clearing surrounded by tall pine trees where the ground was covered with dry needles. It looked like a good spot to rest for a moment and check my surroundings. I sat down, leaning against a rough tree trunk, and pulled out my water bottle. The forest was alive with quiet sounds, the rustle of leaves, the distant tapping of a woodpecker, the soft hum of insects starting their night shift. I realized I hadn't eaten much all day. The snacks in my bag were simple, some crackers and a small pack of nuts, but they helped settle my stomach. I kept my flashlight close but didn't turn it on. The natural light from the fading sun and rising moon was enough for now, and I wanted to stay aware of my environment. Something about switching on the light here felt like breaking a silent agreement with the forest. I thought about how I got here. The shortcut I took seemed like a good idea at first. I had been tired of the long highways and traffic and thought a smaller road might save time. But the map on my phone had lost signal, and the GPS kept spinning in circles. When the road turned to dirt and then almost disappeared, I should have turned back, but I had kept going. Part of me wanted to see what was out here, what the silence looked like. Darkness was creeping fast now. The sky had shifted to a deep navy, and the stars were more visible. I could hear the occasional snap of a twig or the faint rustle of something moving nearby. I stayed still and listened, trying to learn what the forest was telling me. It wasn't threatening, just alive. Suddenly, a sound caught my attention. A soft crunching, closer this time. I turned my head slowly toward the noise and saw a pair of eyes reflecting faintly in the moonlight, watching me from behind a bush. For a moment, I froze, heart beating quickly. The eyes blinked, and then a large deer stepped out into the clearing, its body sleek and silent. It paused, then moved gracefully through the trees. I watched it disappear into the shadows, feeling a strange calm wash over me. I stayed there a while longer, sitting against the tree, letting the forest wrap around me. The loneliness that had crept in earlier now felt different. It wasn't fear. It was peace mixed with a sense of being small in a vast world. But I knew I couldn't stay in the clearing forever. I needed to find a way back. I stood up, brushing pine needles from my jacket, and looked around. The path wasn't clear anymore. The road had vanished under leaves and branches. The forest had taken it back. I decided to follow the direction I thought I had come from, using the stars to guide me. The North Star was faint but visible, and I aimed toward it, hoping it would lead me to some sign of civilization. I walked carefully, trying to keep track of landmarks. A bent tree, a patch of ferns, a fallen log, to avoid going in circles. After what felt like an hour, I saw a faint glow through the trees. At first, I thought it might be firelight or a camp, but as I got closer, I realized it was the soft yellow of a streetlight, far off but clear. My pace quickened, heart lifting with hope. The road wasn't far now. I broke through the last line of trees and stood on the edge of a quiet country road. A few houses dotted the roadside, their windows dark except for one porch light swinging gently in the breeze. The sky above was wide and clear, and the air smelled cleaner, fresher. I walked toward the nearest house and found a phone on the porch. I called a friend, explained my situation briefly, and waited for someone to come pick me up. As I sat there under the porch light, I thought about the hours I had spent in the forest, the silence, the stillness, the strange peace I'd found in the middle of nowhere. The experience stayed with me long after I was back in my car, driving the familiar highways. The forest had shown me something unexpected, a quiet reminder that sometimes being lost means finding something new inside yourself, and that even when everything seems empty and unknown, there's always a path back, as long as you keep moving forward. I was driving down a dirt road that barely showed on the map. The sky was an endless stretch of gray, thick clouds pressing low, making the trees around me look darker, almost like shadows. The road was uneven, covered in gravel and broken by ruts and potholes. I didn't see any other cars or signs of life for miles, just thick woods on both sides. This place was so remote, I wasn't even sure if my phone had a signal anymore. I was alone, far from any town or city, in the middle of nowhere. My plan was simple. I wanted to get away from everything for a while. No noise, no people, no distractions. Just me and the quiet of the wilderness. I had packed a small backpack with essentials, some water, a little food, a flashlight, a first aid kit, and a blanket. My car was an old, beat-up pickup truck, the kind you'd expect to find in places like this. It was sturdy, but not fancy. I had a feeling it would be perfect for this kind of trip. The sun was starting to sink behind the trees when I finally found a small clearing. It wasn't much, a flat patch of dirt surrounded by tall pines, but it was enough for me to pull the truck off the road. I got out and took a deep breath. The air smelled of pine needles, damp earth, and something wild I couldn't quite place. The silence was heavy. No birds, no insects, just the soft rustling of leaves in the light wind. I unloaded my backpack and set up a small camp near the truck. I gathered some dry branches and sticks, careful to avoid the damp ones, and built a little fire pit surrounded by stones. Using a lighter I always kept in my pocket, I managed to get the fire going. The flames flickered, casting warm light and dancing shadows on the trees around me. It felt good to be so close to something simple and real. Night fell quickly. The darkness pressed down, thick and complete. The only light came from my fire, flickering and crackling. The temperature dropped, and I wrapped myself in the blanket. I stared up at the sky, though the clouds covered most of the stars. I could hear the distant sounds of animals, maybe a coyote or some other creature moving quietly through the underbrush. I tried to settle in for the night, but sleep was slow to come. Every little noise felt louder out here, and my mind kept wandering. I thought about the isolation, how easy it would be for someone to get lost or worse in a place like this. The nearest town was at least an hour away, and the roads leading out were little more than tracks. If something went wrong, help might not come in time. Around midnight, the fire was almost out, and I was starting to nod off when I heard it. Something heavy moving through the trees. Not a person, but something big. My heart rate quickened, and I grabbed my flashlight. I didn't shine it directly into the woods, but I tried to catch any sign of movement. The beam caught a pair of glowing eyes watching me from the edge of the clearing. It was a large deer, standing still, curious but cautious. I breathed a little easier and let the beam drop. The deer watched me for a moment longer, then turned and disappeared silently into the trees. I felt a strange mix of relief and loneliness. This place was wild and untamed, and I was a visitor. I lay back down, pulling the blanket over me. The cold was starting to seep in, and I realized I hadn't prepared for how much the temperature could drop at night. I thought about the morning, about getting back on the road and heading toward civilization. But for now, I just tried to rest. Morning came with a soft light, filtered through the thick clouds. The air was damp, and the ground was cold beneath me. I got up slowly, feeling the stiffness in my muscles from sleeping on the hard ground. I put out the remnants of the fire, making sure there were no glowing embers left to cause a problem. Then I packed up my things, careful not to leave any trace behind. Before I left, I took a walk around the clearing. The woods looked different in daylight, less intimidating but still vast and endless. I spotted some animal tracks near the edge of the clearing, probably from the deer I saw the night before. The trees were tall and close together, their bark rough and wet with morning dew. Small patches of moss grew on fallen branches, and here and there, wildflowers peeked through the undergrowth. As I walked back to my truck, I felt a strange calm. The solitude had been hard, but it was also exactly what I needed. Being out here, away from the noise and pressure of everyday life, forced me to slow down and notice things I usually ignored. The simple sounds of nature, the way the light changed through the trees, the feeling of fresh air filling my lungs. It was grounding. I started the truck and eased back onto the dirt road, the tires crunching over the gravel. The clouds had thinned a bit, and the sun was breaking through in spots. I thought about how this place, so empty and wild, wasn't scary or lonely. It was honest, real. It reminded me that sometimes you have to leave everything behind to find something important inside yourself. Driving back toward the main road, I felt a little lighter. The world would be waiting for me when I got home. Work, responsibilities, noise. But for now, I carried a piece of that quiet wilderness with me. A reminder that even in the middle of nowhere, you can find something worth holding on to. I never thought a simple drive through the countryside would turn into one of the most unforgettable experiences of my life. It was supposed to be an easy day. Just me, my old car, and a long stretch of empty roads leading nowhere important. I wanted to get away from the noise of the city for a while, to clear my head. So I grabbed a few supplies, filled up the tank, and headed out early in the morning, before the sun got too high. The first few hours were peaceful, almost soothing. The road was narrow and cracked, lined with tall grass and wildflowers that swayed gently in the breeze. Small farms and empty fields stretched out on either side, and I didn't see another car for miles. The only sounds were the soft hum of the engine and the occasional bird call. I stopped once at a rundown gas station to grab a bottle of water and a sandwich. The place was barely holding itself together, paint peeling off the walls and weeds growing through cracks in the pavement. The man working there was quiet but polite, and I barely spoke to him before getting back on the road. After a while, the pavement turned into gravel. The road narrowed even more, twisting through patches of dense forest. The trees grew thick and tall, their branches meeting overhead to form a shadowy canopy. The air smelled fresh and earthy, with hints of pine and damp soil. I rolled the windows down, letting the cool air rush in. I felt like I was driving into another world, one that existed far away from the busy streets and crowded buildings I was used to. I noticed that the GPS signal started flickering, then disappeared altogether. The small screen on my dashboard went blank, leaving me with no idea exactly where I was or how far I had left to go. But I wasn't worried. The road was still clear, and the sky was bright blue. I kept going, trusting the little map I had printed out before I left. After what felt like hours, I saw a faint sign on the side of the road. It was rusty and almost unreadable, but I made out the word Cedar. I figured it must be the name of the small town or village nearby. There was no other traffic, no buildings in sight, just a dirt path veering off into the trees. I decided to take it, thinking maybe I'd find a place to rest or at least get some fresh coffee. The path was narrow and uneven. My car bounced over rocks and deep ruts, the tires crunching on the loose gravel. Trees crowded closer on either side, blocking most of the sunlight. The silence was heavier here, broken only by the occasional snap of a twig or the rustle of leaves. The further I drove, the more isolated I felt. The forest was dense and seemed endless. After a while, the path opened up into a small clearing. In the middle was an old, weathered cabin. It looked like it hadn't been lived in for years. The wooden boards were faded and cracked, and the windows were dirty and cracked. Around the cabin, the grass was tall and unkempt, dotted with wildflowers and weeds. A broken-down truck sat half-hidden in the bushes nearby, its paint chipped and rusted. Curiosity pulled me out of the car. I walked slowly toward the cabin, noticing how quiet everything was. The air smelled damp and musty, like the forest itself was holding its breath. I examined the door, which was slightly ajar. I pushed it gently and it creaked open. Inside, the cabin was empty except for some old furniture covered in dust and cobwebs. The floorboards were warped, and sunlight filtered weakly through the grimy windows. I didn't find anything valuable or interesting inside, just signs of someone having lived there long ago. An old, rusted stove, a broken chair, some faded photographs on the wall that were too damaged to make out clearly. It was clear this place had been abandoned for a long time. Still, the quiet and isolation made me think about what life must have been like out here, completely cut off from the world. I got back into the car, eager to keep moving. The sun was beginning to dip lower, casting long shadows through the trees. I realized I had no idea how far I was from the main road or how long it would take to get back. The gravel path seemed to stretch endlessly into the darkening forest. As I drove back the way I came, I noticed the air was cooler now, and the sky was turning shades of pink and orange. The forest around me seemed different in the fading light, more alive, but also more uncertain. The shadows grew longer, and the silence felt heavier. My headlights cut through the dusk, illuminating the road ahead. Suddenly, my car jolted. I slammed on the brakes and pulled over to the side. One of the tires was flat, completely shredded and useless. I cursed under my breath, realizing I had no spare tire and no cell signal. Panic tried to creep in, but I took a deep breath to steady myself. I grabbed the emergency kit and a flashlight from the trunk. The forest was closing in around me. I knew I couldn't just sit and wait for help. There was no one coming out here. I decided to try and walk back the way I came, hoping to find some sign of civilization or at least the main road. With the flashlight in hand, I started down the gravel path. The ground was uneven, and my legs grew tired quickly. The trees seemed to lean in closer as I walked, their branches scratching the air above me. The forest floor was thick with leaves and fallen branches, and every step kicked up the smell of earth and moss. After what felt like an hour, I saw a faint light ahead, quickened my pace, heart pounding with hope. As I got closer, I realized it was a small campfire, surrounded by a few empty chairs. There was no one there, but the fire was still warm, and some logs had been recently stacked nearby. I felt a wave of relief. Someone had been here recently, which meant I wasn't completely alone in the middle of nowhere. I sat down by the fire for a moment, letting the warmth soak into my tired bones. Then I decided to follow the direction where the fire's smoke was drifting, hoping it would lead me to a road or a house. The trail led me out of the thick forest and onto a narrow dirt road. The moon was rising now, casting a silver light over the landscape. In the distance, I saw faint lights blinking, probably from houses or a small town. After walking for another half hour, I reached a farmhouse. The porch light was on, and smoke was coming from the chimney. I knocked on the door, and a kind-faced man answered. He invited me inside without hesitation. I explained my situation with gestures and a few words, and he offered me water, food, and a phone to call for help. That night, I stayed at the farmhouse. I slept better than I had in weeks, safe in the warmth of a home after hours of wandering alone in the wild. The next morning, a neighbor helped me change the tire on my car. They pointed me toward the nearest town, where I could get more supplies and find my way back to the city. Driving away from that place, I looked back at the dense forest and the gravel path disappearing into the trees. It was strange to think how close I had been to being truly lost. But the quiet, the isolation, and even the fear had given me a new appreciation for the simple things. A warm fire, a helping hand, and the safety of the road. The experience reminded me that sometimes, even when we feel completely alone, there are signs and people nearby, ready to help if we can just find them. And no matter how far you go into the middle of nowhere, there's always a way back. The sun was already low when I left the main road. I had been driving for hours, passing through small towns and endless stretches of farmland. But the moment I turned off onto that narrow gravel path, it felt like I was stepping into a different world. The trees grew thicker, darker, and the air smelled sharp and fresh, like pine and earth. There were no houses around, no signs of life except for the hum of insects and the occasional bird calling somewhere high up in the branches. It was the kind of place people rarely talked about, the middle of nowhere. I was on my way to a small cabin that my uncle had left to me. It wasn't fancy, just a wooden shack, a single room with a fireplace and a rusty old stove. But it was mine. I wanted to get away from the noise of the city, the constant rush, the endless stream of people and problems. Here, there was nothing but silence, broken only by the sounds of nature. The road got rougher as I drove deeper into the woods. The gravel shifted under the tires, and the narrow path twisted between tall trees that seemed to lean in close like they were watching. I had to slow down, careful not to skid or hit a hidden rock. The last mile was barely more than a track, overgrown with grass and weeds that scratched the sides of the truck. When I finally pulled up next to the cabin, the engine died with a soft thud, and the silence settled around me like a thick blanket. I climbed out, the cold air hitting my face, sharper now with the fading daylight. The cabin looked older than I remembered from the last time I visited years ago. The paint was peeling, the windows dusty, and the door sagged a little on its hinges. I grabbed my bag and stepped inside. The air was cool and smelled of wood and something faintly musty. Old memories, I guessed. The floor creaked under my boots, and dust floated in the thin shafts of light from the windows. I set my things down and went straight to the fireplace. There was a small pile of wood stacked in the corner, but it was damp and crumbly. I found some dry sticks outside, along with dead leaves, and carefully arranged them. After a few tries, the fire caught, the flames flickering and warming the room. The orange light pushed back the growing shadows, and for a moment, the cabin felt alive. Outside, the darkness deepened quickly. The stars appeared one by one in the clear sky, bright and cold. I stepped out on the small porch and took a deep breath. The forest around me was vast and quiet, except for the occasional rustle of leaves or the distant call of an owl. It was beautiful but also a little intimidating. Out here, there was no cell signal, no streetlights, no one to hear if something went wrong. I spent the evening unpacking the few supplies I brought. There was a small fridge, powered by a solar panel on the roof, but I hadn't counted on it to work well after months without use. The food was mostly canned goods and dried things, enough to last me a few days. I made a simple dinner over the fire, some beans warmed in a small pot, a piece of bread I found in a tin. The quiet was overwhelming at first. My mind kept racing with thoughts, memories, worries. But slowly, the stillness settled in, and I found a strange comfort in it. That night, I slept in the single bed against the wall, wrapped in a thick blanket. The wind outside picked up, making the trees sway and groan. The cabin creaked and settled, and at times, I heard the distant sound of animals moving through the underbrush. I didn't feel scared, just very aware of how alone I was. No one around for miles, just me and the woods. The next morning, I woke early, the sunlight filtering through the thin curtains. I went outside and walked down the small dirt path that led from the cabin. The forest was alive with birdsong and the rustle of small creatures in the leaves. I found a narrow creek nearby, water clear and cold. I knelt down and drank directly from it, the chill waking me up better than any coffee. I spent the day exploring the area, careful not to wander too far. The woods were thick, the ground uneven with roots and fallen branches. Every now and then, I spotted a deer or heard the snap of a twig from some unseen animal. I noticed old tracks, maybe from a coyote or a fox, and the broken remains of a bird's nest. The forest felt ancient and full of stories, silent but full of life. As evening came again, I made another fire and sat close to it, feeling the warmth against the cool air. I thought about the city, about the noise and crowds I'd left behind. Here, life was stripped down to basics: fire, food, water, shelter. No distractions, no endless worries, just survival and the slow passing of time. The second night was quieter, almost peaceful. I stayed awake longer, watching the stars wheel across the sky. The Milky Way stretched like a pale river above the trees. I felt small in that vastness, but also connected somehow. The silence wasn't empty. It was full of things I had never noticed before. On the third day, I planned to head back. I packed my things carefully, made sure the fire was out, and locked the door behind me. As I drove back down the rough gravel path, I felt a strange mix of relief and sadness. The city was waiting with its noise and chaos, but the woods had given me something important: a chance to slow down, to breathe, and to remember what it felt like to be alone with myself. By the time I reached the main road again, the sun was high, and the world felt different. The middle of nowhere wasn't just a place. It was a reminder that sometimes you have to step away from everything to find what really matters. The cabin would be there waiting for me, quiet and steady, whenever I needed to come back and remember that. And that was enough. The sun had already started to sink low when I found myself driving down a narrow dirt road that stretched far beyond the reach of any map I'd ever seen. The tires of my old truck kicked up dust that hung thick in the dry air. Around me, there was nothing but endless stretches of brown grass, twisted scrub bushes, and the occasional ragged tree that looked as worn and tired as I felt. I was in the middle of nowhere. No towns, no houses, no other cars. Just the land and the sky, wide and empty. I had taken this trip on a whim, just to get away from the noise of the city, the crowds, and the constant buzz of screens and voices. My plan was simple: find a quiet spot, set up a small camp, and spend a couple of days alone with just the earth and sky. No phones, no internet, no distractions. I had packed a few essentials: some water, canned food, a basic tent, a sleeping bag, and my old pocket knife. Not much, but enough to last if I was careful. The road ended abruptly at a small clearing near a shallow creek. The water wasn't clear, but it was enough to fill my bottle after I filtered it with the little kit I had. I pulled the truck to the side and started unloading my gear. The sun was almost gone now, and the sky was painted in shades of orange and deep purple. I set up the tent slowly, making sure it was tight and secure. The wind had started to pick up, and the dry grass rustled all around me like a whisper. Once the tent was up, I gathered some wood for a fire. The brush around was sparse, but I found enough dry twigs and branches to make a small pile. Lighting the fire was harder than I expected. My lighter didn't work well, and the wood was damp in places. After a few tries, I finally managed a small flame that grew steady and warm. The firelight flickered over the trees and the grass, throwing shadows that danced in the darkness. I sat close to the fire, eating from my cans, some beans and a bit of canned meat. The quiet was absolute. No cars, no voices, no planes overhead. Just the occasional sound of a bird far off, or the creak of a tree in the wind. It was the kind of quiet that presses on you, makes you aware of every small noise your body makes. My own breathing felt loud. As the night deepened, the temperature dropped fast. I pulled my jacket tighter around me and stared up at the stars. The sky was a blanket of tiny, sharp lights, clearer than I had ever seen them in the city. It was beautiful and unsettling at the same time. I felt small, almost invisible out here. Suddenly, I heard something move in the brush near the creek. At first, I thought it was just an animal, maybe a raccoon or a fox, but the sound was closer, heavier. The snapping of twigs and rustling leaves told me whatever it was had stopped to watch or listen. I reached for my pocket knife, feeling the cold metal in my hand. I didn't want trouble, but I wasn't about to be caught off guard either. The firelight flickered, and I caught a glimpse of a large shape moving between the trees. It was too big for any small animal, something at least the size of a dog or bigger. I held my breath, trying not to make a sound. The shape stopped at the edge of the clearing and stood still, watching me. I didn't move, didn't even blink. After what felt like minutes, it turned away and disappeared back into the darkness. My heart was pounding. The moment had felt charged with danger, but there was no scream or rush, just silence again. I stayed by the fire the rest of the night, never letting the flame go out. When dawn finally broke, the light spilled across the land, turning everything soft and golden. The feeling of danger melted into relief. The next morning, I packed up quickly. The strange presence from the night before lingered in my mind, but I told myself it was just a wild animal. Still, I was glad to be leaving. Driving back the way I came, the truck bouncing over the uneven road, I kept my eyes on the trees and the edge of the road. No other signs of movement appeared. After several hours, I reached a paved highway and then a small town where I stopped for gas and food. The bright lights and sounds were almost overwhelming after the silence. The town felt alive, messy, and loud, but it was safe. I thought about the emptiness behind me, the wide sky and the lonely land, and realized how much I had needed that quiet, even with the scare. The trip was over, but the memory stayed with me. That feeling of being alone in a place so far from everything, where the land seemed endless and time moved slow, was something I couldn't forget. It taught me how small I was and how careful I had to be. The land out there didn't care about me. It just was wild and untamed. And that's what made it real. No stories, no fantasies. Just me, the earth, and the raw, simple truth of being truly alone in the middle of nowhere. The sun was just dipping below the horizon when I found myself driving down a narrow, dusty road that seemed to stretch on forever. The kind of road that disappears into nothing but fields of dry grass and a scattering of scraggly trees. No streetlights, no signs except for the occasional faded marker covered in grime and rust. It felt like I was driving through the middle of nowhere, the kind of place people don't usually pass through unless they're lost or searching for something they don't quite understand. I had been on the road for hours. My truck's headlights cut through the thickening dusk, but even their reach felt small against the vast emptiness around me. There were no other cars, no houses, nothing but open land and sky stretching wide. The air smelled dry and faintly of earth, with a whisper of smoke from some distant fire or farm. It was quiet except for the low hum of the engine and the crunch of tires on the gravel. I'd taken this route because my GPS had died earlier that day. No signal, no map, just the road ahead and my own instincts. At first, I wasn't worried. Sometimes a little detour in the countryside is peaceful. But as the light faded, I started feeling the weight of being so isolated. The kind of isolation that sinks in slow, wrapping around your thoughts and making every sound sharper, every shadow longer. I stopped the truck once, about an hour before nightfall. There was a small clearing on the side of the road, a patch of grass that looked soft enough to sit on. I stepped out, stretching my legs. The ground was uneven and cracked, dry from weeks without rain. The grass whispered faintly in the wind, a restless sound that made the silence feel even thicker. I could see the sky now, vast and endless, with the first stars beginning to appear. It was beautiful in a way that made you feel small and reminded me how far away I was from everything familiar. Something about the quiet made me think. I wondered how many people had passed this way before me, if anyone lived nearby or if this was just a forgotten path, used only by travelers like me or by farmers tending to far-off fields. There was no sign of life, no distant lights or sounds from animals. Just the wind moving through the tall grass and the faint rustle of leaves in the scattered trees. After a few minutes, I climbed back into the truck and kept moving forward. The road seemed to stretch endlessly ahead, twisting and turning in ways that made it hard to tell how far I had come. My headlights caught on old fence posts, some leaning crookedly, others broken down completely. The fence marked no property I could see. The land beyond looked wild and untamed. As night fully settled, the temperature dropped quickly. The air became sharp and cold, biting through my jacket. I turned the heater up, but it barely made a difference. I could see my breath fogging up the windows, and the truck's engine sounded louder in the stillness. Every now and then, the road would narrow and the trees would press closer on either side, creating shadows that flickered as I passed. At one point, I noticed something on the side of the road, a set of tire tracks leading off into the field. They were fresh, the dirt still loose and soft. I slowed down to look closer. The tracks disappeared into the tall grass and then stopped abruptly, as if whatever made them had turned off or gotten stuck. The thought made me pause, a small knot of unease settling in my chest. But I shook it off and pressed on. Time lost meaning as I drove. The sky was now a deep black canvas, with stars scattered like tiny points of cold light. I felt tired but kept my eyes on the road. I told myself there was no hurry, but inside I hoped to find something. Maybe a sign of life, a house, or at least a town. But all I saw was the same empty land, rolling hills, and the occasional dark shape of a tree. Suddenly, the truck jolted. I slammed on the brakes and the vehicle screeched to a stop. The headlights revealed a large hole in the middle of the road, a pothole so deep it could have swallowed the front axle. How had I missed it? The road was so rough and uneven, it was easy to overlook. I got out, flashlight in hand, to inspect the damage. The hole was about 3 feet across and looked like it had been there for some time, maybe caused by heavy rains or erosion. I checked the tires. The front right tire had taken a hard hit, but luckily it wasn't flat, just a little scuffed. Still, this was a warning. This road wasn't maintained and could be dangerous if I wasn't careful. I decided to slow down and keep driving, but the feeling of being stranded in the middle of nowhere grew heavier. A few miles later, I spotted a faint glow ahead. At first, I thought it might be headlights from another vehicle. As I got closer, it turned out to be a small gas station, barely more than a shack with a single pump and a flickering neon sign. The windows were dirty and dark inside, but the light outside was a welcome sight. I pulled in and parked. The ground was gravel, uneven and dusty. I turned off the truck and sat for a moment, letting the silence wrap around me again. I was tired, hungry, and ready to stop moving. I opened the glove box and pulled out a bottle of water and a granola bar I'd packed. The cold air bit at my skin as I ate, and I thought about the long drive ahead. No one came out of the gas station. No other cars were around. It was a place that felt stuck in time, a remnant of a road that few traveled. I glanced at the gas pump, empty. No way to fill up if I needed. The nearest town was still miles away. I realized I'd have to be careful with what I had. The night grew colder, and the stars shone brighter, clearer than I'd ever seen them. I decided to rest a bit before pushing on. I sat back in the truck, turned on the heater just enough to take the chill off, and let my eyes close for a moment. When I woke up a few hours later, it was just before dawn. The sky was starting to lighten, a pale blue creeping over the horizon. The air had warmed a little but still held that early morning sharpness. I felt better after the short rest, ready to get moving again. The road ahead was long and empty, but I was no longer afraid. I had made it this far, through miles of nothing but sky and dirt and silence. There was something humbling about being so alone in the world, something that forced me to rely on myself and my own strength. I started the truck and pulled back onto the road. The sun rose slowly, casting long shadows across the land, lighting up the fields and trees with a warm glow. As the light grew, I finally saw signs of life. A farmhouse in the distance, a few animals grazing, smoke curling from a chimney. The feeling of isolation faded, replaced by a quiet sense of hope. Driving toward those signs, I realized that even in the middle of nowhere, life carries on. People live, work, and wait for the morning light just like I did. The emptiness wasn't endless. It was just part of the journey, a reminder of how far I'd come and how much farther I could go. By the time I reached the farmhouse, the sun was fully up. The road became clearer, the world more familiar. I was no longer lost in the middle of nowhere, but moving forward, 1 mile at a time, toward somewhere real. I was driving for hours through a stretch of land that looked like it hadn't changed in decades. The highway was a narrow ribbon cutting through endless fields, and around me was nothing but flat ground, dry grass, and low shrubs. The sky was a heavy, dull gray, hanging low, pressing down on the landscape like a thick blanket. No towns, no houses, no signs of life besides the occasional bird skimming just above the ground or a lone cow standing motionless in the distance. The road was straight, perfectly straight for miles, and it was easy to lose track of time out here. The only sound was the steady hum of the engine and the tires rolling over the cracked asphalt. I wasn't in any hurry, though. I had packed a small bag and left the city that morning, wanting to escape the noise and the crowds. I needed space to think, somewhere far from everything. This stretch of nowhere seemed to fit that exactly. There was a small gas station about 50 miles back, and after that I hadn't seen any signs of civilization. The fuel gauge was creeping toward empty, but I had hoped to make it to the next town, which, according to the map, was another 40 miles down the road. As the afternoon slipped into early evening, the light began to fade. The sky turned a pale orange near the horizon, and the fields lost their color, becoming dark shapes in the distance. I pulled over onto a gravel shoulder and stepped out to stretch my legs. The air was dry and still. I could hear the faint rustle of dry grass and the distant call of a hawk somewhere overhead. I looked around, trying to get my bearings. The road ahead disappeared into a thin line of trees that marked the edge of a small forest. Beyond that, the map showed nothing but more open land for miles. I decided to keep going. Maybe I would find a place to stop once the sun was fully down. I got back in the car and turned on the headlights. The beam cut a narrow path through the growing darkness. About 20 miles later, the fuel light finally came on. I knew I was running on fumes now. The engine sputtered once or twice, warning me it wouldn't last much longer. I slowed down, trying to conserve what little gas I had left. The forest on the side of the road grew thicker, and the air smelled different, cooler, damp. I started to feel a little uneasy, not scared exactly, but aware of how isolated I was. Suddenly, the engine made a strange noise and died. The car rolled to a stop just past a small dirt driveway leading into the trees. I tried the ignition again, but nothing happened. I was stranded. I stepped out into the cold night air. The sky was clear now, stars scattered across it like tiny bright dots. No moon, just pure darkness beyond the reach of my headlights. The silence was overwhelming. No cars, no animals, nothing but the faint sound of wind through the leaves. I checked my phone, no signal. Great. I wasn't completely surprised, but it still hit me like a punch. I was alone, stuck in the middle of nowhere, with no way to call for help. I looked down the dirt driveway. It disappeared into the forest like a black tunnel. There was no way to know how long the path was or where it led. But staying by the car didn't feel like an option. If no one passed by soon, I would be here all night. I grabbed my bag from the trunk. Just some water, snacks, a flashlight, and a thin jacket, and started walking down the driveway. The trees closed in quickly, their branches brushing against my jacket. The ground was uneven, scattered with dry leaves and twigs that crunched underfoot. The air smelled earthy and fresh in a way that was strange after hours on the road. I kept moving, stepping carefully. Every so often, I shone the flashlight around, catching glimpses of the thick undergrowth and the rough bark of trees. I didn't know if this path led to a house, a farm, or just deeper into the woods. But I had no choice but to keep going. After about 30 minutes, the path opened into a small clearing. In the center was an old wooden cabin, its paint faded and peeling. A faint yellow light glowed through the window. The place looked lived in but rough, like someone had been here a long time ago and kept it going with whatever they could find. I approached slowly, feeling a mix of relief and caution. No one came out when I knocked on the door, but it creaked open easily. Inside, the cabin was small but tidy. A wood stove sat in one corner with a small fire still burning. There were a few chairs, a table with some dishes, and shelves lined with books and jars filled with dried herbs and food. I set my bag down and took a moment to breathe. The warmth from the stove pushed back the cold night air. There was a radio on the table, old but working, and I turned it on, hoping for a local station. Static, then a crackling voice reading a weather report and some news about a nearby town. The cabin was a lifeline. I sat down on a chair, ate some of my snacks, and drank water. Outside, the wind picked up, and I could hear the branches tapping against the windows. But inside, I felt safe. The next morning, I woke early. The sky was a pale blue, and sunlight filtered through the thin curtains. I explored the cabin a bit more, finding a small shed with tools and a bucket for water. It was clear someone had been living here in a simple, quiet way. I decided to walk back to the road. With daylight, the path looked less intimidating. I followed the driveway back until I reached my car. The engine was still dead. But now, I could see a faint glow from a distant town's lights down the road. I pulled out the flashlight again and started walking toward those lights, hoping to find help. The air was cold but fresh, and the silence felt different in daylight. Less threatening, more like the calm of a place untouched by the rush of the world. After about an hour, I reached a small cluster of houses. A few cars were parked outside, and I finally found someone to call a tow truck. They told me the nearest gas station was just a few miles further and offered to give me a ride. By midday, I was back on the highway, heading away from that lonely stretch of land. The sun was warm, and the road stretched out ahead, promising safety and company. I felt a deep gratitude for the little cabin and the quiet night in the woods. It reminded me how fragile and unpredictable life could be, but also how kindness and care could exist in the most unexpected places. That trip taught me to respect the quiet, to prepare better, and to never take connection for granted. The middle of nowhere was not just a place on the map. It was a test of patience, courage, and the unexpected kindness you might find when you need it the most. I never thought a simple drive through the countryside would turn into one of the most unforgettable experiences of my life. It was supposed to be an easy day. Just me, my old car, and a long stretch of empty roads leading nowhere important. I wanted to get away from the noise of the city for a while, to clear my head. So I grabbed a few supplies, filled up the tank, and headed out early in the morning, before the sun got too high. The first few hours were peaceful, almost soothing. The road was narrow and cracked, lined with tall grass and wildflowers that swayed gently in the breeze. Small farms and empty fields stretched out on either side, and I didn't see another car for miles. The only sounds were the soft hum of the engine and the occasional bird call. I stopped once at a rundown gas station to grab a bottle of water and a sandwich. The place was barely holding itself together, paint peeling off the walls and weeds growing through cracks in the pavement. The man working there was quiet but polite, and I barely spoke to him before getting back on the road. After a while, the pavement turned into gravel. The road narrowed even more, twisting through patches of dense forest. The trees grew thick and tall, their branches meeting overhead to form a shadowy canopy. The air smelled fresh and earthy, with hints of pine and damp soil. I rolled the windows down, letting the cool air rush in. I felt like I was driving into another world, one that existed far away from the busy streets and crowded buildings I was used to. I noticed that the GPS signal started flickering, then disappeared altogether. The small screen on my dashboard went blank, leaving me with no idea exactly where I was or how far I had left to go. But I wasn't worried. The road was still clear, and the sky was bright blue. I kept going, trusting the little map I had printed out before I left. After what felt like hours, I saw a faint sign on the side of the road. It was rusty and almost unreadable, but I made out the word Cedar. I figured it must be the name of the small town or village nearby. There was no other traffic, no buildings in sight, just a dirt path veering off into the trees. I decided to take it, thinking maybe I'd find a place to rest or at least get some fresh coffee. The path was narrow and uneven. My car bounced over rocks and deep ruts, the tires crunching on the loose gravel. Trees crowded closer on either side, blocking most of the sunlight. The silence was heavier here, broken only by the occasional snap of a twig or the rustle of leaves. The further I drove, the more isolated I felt. The forest was dense and seemed endless. After a while, the path opened up into a small clearing. In the middle was an old, weathered cabin. It looked like it hadn't been lived in for years. The wooden boards were faded and cracked, and the windows were dirty and cracked. Around the cabin, the grass was tall and unkempt, dotted with wildflowers and weeds. A broken-down truck sat half-hidden in the bushes nearby, its paint chipped and rusted. Curiosity pulled me out of the car. I walked slowly toward the cabin, noticing how quiet everything was. The air smelled damp and musty, like the forest itself was holding its breath. I examined the door, which was slightly ajar. I pushed it gently and it creaked open. Inside, the cabin was empty except for some old furniture covered in dust and cobwebs. The floorboards were warped, and sunlight filtered weakly through the grimy windows. I didn't find anything valuable or interesting inside, just signs of someone having lived there long ago. An old, rusted stove, a broken chair, some faded photographs on the wall that were too damaged to make out clearly. It was clear this place had been abandoned for a long time. Still, the quiet and isolation made me think about what life must have been like out here, completely cut off from the world. I got back into the car, eager to keep moving. The sun was beginning to dip lower, casting long shadows through the trees. I realized I had no idea how far I was from the main road or how long it would take to get back. The gravel path seemed to stretch endlessly into the darkening forest. As I drove back the way I came, I noticed the air was cooler now, and the sky was turning shades of pink and orange. The forest around me seemed different in the fading light, more alive, but also more uncertain. The shadows grew longer, and the silence felt heavier. My headlights cut through the dusk, illuminating the road ahead. Suddenly, my car jolted. I slammed on the brakes and pulled over to the side. One of the tires was flat, completely shredded and useless. I cursed under my breath, realizing I had no spare tire and no cell signal. Panic tried to creep in, but I took a deep breath to steady myself. I grabbed the emergency kit and a flashlight from the trunk. The forest was closing in around me. I knew I couldn't just sit and wait for help. There was no one coming out here. I decided to try and walk back the way I came, hoping to find some sign of civilization or at least the main road. With the flashlight in hand, I started down the gravel path. The ground was uneven, and my legs grew tired quickly. The trees seemed to lean in closer as I walked, their branches scratching the air above me. The forest floor was thick with leaves and fallen branches, and every step kicked up the smell of earth and moss. After what felt like an hour, I saw a faint light ahead, quickened my pace, heart pounding with hope. As I got closer, I realized it was a small campfire, surrounded by a few empty chairs. There was no one there, but the fire was still warm, and some logs had been recently stacked nearby. I felt a wave of relief. Someone had been here recently, which meant I wasn't completely alone in the middle of nowhere. I sat down by the fire for a moment, letting the warmth soak into my tired bones. Then I decided to follow the direction where the fire's smoke was drifting, hoping it would lead me to a road or a house. The trail led me out of the thick forest and onto a narrow dirt road. The moon was rising now, casting a silver light over the landscape. In the distance, I saw faint lights blinking, probably from houses or a small town. After walking for another half hour, I reached a farmhouse. The porch light was on, and smoke was coming from the chimney. I knocked on the door, and a kind-faced man answered. He invited me inside without hesitation. I explained my situation with gestures and a few words, and he offered me water, food, and a phone to call for help. That night, I stayed at the farmhouse. I slept better than I had in weeks, safe in the warmth of a home after hours of wandering alone in the wild. The next morning, a neighbor helped me change the tire on my car. They pointed me toward the nearest town, where I could get more supplies and find my way back to the city. Driving away from that place, I looked back at the dense forest and the gravel path disappearing into the trees. It was strange to think how close I had been to being truly lost. But the quiet, the isolation, and even the fear had given me a new appreciation for the simple things. A warm fire, a helping hand, and the safety of the road. The experience reminded me that sometimes, even when we feel completely alone, There are signs and people nearby, ready to help if we can just find them. And no matter how far you go into the middle of nowhere, there's always a way back. The sun was already low when I left the main road. I had been driving for hours, passing through small towns and endless stretches of farmland. But the moment I turned off onto that narrow gravel path, it felt like I was stepping into a different world. The trees grew thicker, darker, and the air smelled sharp and fresh, like pine and earth. There were no houses around, no signs of life except for the hum of insects and the occasional bird calling somewhere high up in the branches. It was the kind of place people rarely talked about, the middle of nowhere. I was on my way to a small cabin that my uncle had left to me. It wasn't fancy, just a wooden shack, a single room with a fireplace and a rusty old stove. But it was mine. I wanted to get away from the noise of the city, the constant rush, the endless stream of people and problems. Here, there was nothing but silence, broken only by the sounds of nature. The road got rougher as I drove deeper into the woods. The gravel shifted under the tires, and the narrow path twisted between tall trees that seemed to lean in close like they were watching. I had to slow down, careful not to skid or hit a hidden rock. The last mile was barely more than a track, overgrown with grass and weeds that scratched the sides of the truck. When I finally pulled up next to the cabin, the engine died with a soft thud, and the silence settled around me like a thick blanket. I climbed out, the cold air hitting my face, sharper now with the fading daylight. The cabin looked older than I remembered from the last time I visited years ago. The paint was peeling, the windows dusty, and the door sagged a little on its hinges. I grabbed my bag and stepped inside. The air was cool and smelled of wood and something faintly musty. Old memories, I guessed. The floor creaked under my boots, and dust floated in the thin shafts of light from the windows. I set my things down and went straight to the fireplace. There was a small pile of wood stacked in the corner, but it was damp and crumbly. I found some dry sticks outside, along with dead leaves, and carefully arranged them. After a few tries, the fire caught, the flames flickering and warming the room. The orange light pushed back the growing shadows, and for a moment, the cabin felt alive. Outside, the darkness deepened quickly. The stars appeared one by one in the clear sky, bright and cold. I stepped out on the small porch and took a deep breath. The forest around me was vast and quiet, except for the occasional rustle of leaves or the distant call of an owl. It was beautiful but also a little intimidating. Out here, there was no cell signal, no streetlights, no one to hear if something went wrong. I spent the evening unpacking the few supplies I brought. There was a small fridge, powered by a solar panel on the roof, but I hadn't counted on it to work well after months without use. The food was mostly canned goods and dried things, enough to last me a few days. I made a simple dinner over the fire, some beans warmed in a small pot, a piece of bread I found in a tin. The quiet was overwhelming at first. My mind kept racing with thoughts, memories, worries. But slowly, the stillness settled in, and I found a strange comfort in it. That night, I slept in the single bed against the wall, wrapped in a thick blanket. The wind outside picked up, making the trees sway and groan. The cabin creaked and settled, and at times, I heard the distant sound of animals moving through the underbrush. I didn't feel scared, just very aware of how alone I was. No one around for miles, just me and the woods. The next morning, I woke early, the sunlight filtering through the thin curtains. I went outside and walked down the small dirt path that led from the cabin. The forest was alive with birdsong and the rustle of small creatures in the leaves. I found a narrow creek nearby, water clear and cold. I knelt down and drank directly from it, the chill waking me up better than any coffee. I spent the day exploring the area, careful not to wander too far. The woods were thick, the ground uneven with roots and fallen branches. Every now and then, I spotted a deer or heard the snap of a twig from some unseen animal. I noticed old tracks, maybe from a coyote or a fox, and the broken remains of a bird's nest. The forest felt ancient and full of stories, silent but full of life. As evening came again, I made another fire and sat close to it, feeling the warmth against the cool air. I thought about the city, about the noise and crowds I'd left behind. Here, life was stripped down to basics: fire, food, water, shelter. No distractions, no endless worries, just survival and the slow passing of time. The second night was quieter, almost peaceful. I stayed awake longer, watching the stars wheel across the sky. The Milky Way stretched like a pale river above the trees. I felt small in that vastness, but also connected somehow. The silence wasn't empty. It was full of things I had never noticed before. On the third day, I planned to head back. I packed my things carefully, made sure the fire was out, and locked the door behind me. As I drove back down the rough gravel path, I felt a strange mix of relief and sadness. The city was waiting with its noise and chaos, but the woods had given me something important: a chance to slow down, to breathe, and to remember what it felt like to be alone with myself. By the time I reached the main road again, the sun was high, and the world felt different. The middle of nowhere wasn't just a place. It was a reminder that sometimes you have to step away from everything to find what really matters. The cabin would be there waiting for me, quiet and steady, whenever I needed to come back and remember that. And that was enough. I was driving through the middle of nowhere, miles away from the nearest town or any sign of life. The sun had just dipped below the horizon, leaving the sky painted in soft purples and deep blues. The road was a narrow strip of cracked asphalt that stretched endlessly into the darkness ahead. I had no plan other than to keep moving forward, hoping to find a place to rest before the night grew too cold. The landscape around me was rough and open. Dry grass and scattered bushes lined the road, their shadows stretching long in the fading light. Far off to one side, I could make out the jagged outline of low hills, but they were so distant and dark that it was hard to tell exactly where the earth ended and the sky began. There was nothing else: no buildings, no streetlights, no other cars. Just silence, broken only by the soft hum of my engine and the occasional call of a bird settling down for the night. I slowed down as I spotted a small dirt track leading off from the main road. It looked like an old farm road, overgrown and barely used. My instincts told me it was a bad idea to go down there in the dark, but the thought of sitting in my car with the heater off, feeling the cold creep in, made me decide to take the chance. I turned onto the dirt path, kicking up dust behind my tires. The track was bumpy, uneven, and narrow. Tall weeds brushed against the windows, and I had to steer carefully to avoid hidden ruts and rocks. After a few minutes, the path opened into a small clearing surrounded by tall trees. It wasn't much, a patch of dirt with some flattened grass, enough to park my car, but it felt like a shelter from the vast emptiness outside. I turned off the engine and sat there for a moment, listening. The night was darker than I expected, and the only light came from a faint moon just peeking out from behind the clouds. I opened the car door and stepped outside. The air was cool and smelled of dry earth and pine. I walked a little around the clearing, my boots crunching on the gravel. The trees around me stood tall and still, their branches creaking softly in the night breeze. There was no one else for miles. The silence was complete, and it pressed in on me, making my own breathing feel loud and exposed. I realized I was alone in a way I rarely had been before. No sounds from other cars or people, no distant city hum, no blinking lights. Just me, the dark woods, and the quiet night. The clearing was small, maybe big enough for a few tents. I thought about camping, but I hadn't brought any gear beyond a thin jacket and a small backpack. No sleeping bag, no food except a couple of energy bars. I hadn't planned to be here. I was supposed to be on a quick drive across the state, but I had taken a wrong turn somewhere and kept going, hoping to find a gas station or a motel. None had come. I pulled out my phone and tried to get a signal. Nothing. No bars, no service. I was truly cut off. The night deepened. The temperature dropped sharply, and the air felt drier, stinging my skin. I got back in the car and started the heater. It was an old model, so the heater took a while to warm the cabin, but after a few minutes, the warmth spread through the seats and dashboard. I leaned back and tried to rest, but sleep didn't come easily. Every little noise outside caught my attention. The rustling of leaves, the distant snap of a twig, the soft whistle of the wind through the trees. Hours passed. At some point, I heard the distant roar of an engine. My heart jumped. I sat up, eyes fixed on the narrow dirt track leading out of the clearing. A vehicle was coming. It was a truck, slow and steady, its headlights cutting through the darkness. As it got closer, I could see it was old, covered in dust, with a faded paint job. It stopped a few yards from where I was parked. The driver didn't get out. The truck idled for a long moment, then slowly turned around and disappeared back the way it came. I wondered who it was, why they stopped and then left without saying anything. But I didn't have time to think about it because soon after, I saw lights in the sky. Not stars, but a set of bright, moving lights like a helicopter or a drone. They hovered above the trees, moving slowly and steadily. I pulled out my phone again, hoping to catch a signal or some kind of emergency broadcast. Still nothing. I realized that this place was so far off the grid that any help or contact was hours, maybe days away. The rest of the night was long and quiet, except for those occasional signs that life was still moving somewhere nearby. The truck that passed, the lights above the trees. They gave me a strange comfort, proof that I wasn't completely alone, even if no one was close enough to help immediately. When dawn finally broke, the sky slowly shifted from deep blue to pale gray, then to the soft gold of morning light. The chill in the air faded, replaced by the gentle warmth of the sun rising over the hills. I stepped out of the car again and took a deep breath. The woods around the clearing looked different in daylight, less mysterious, less intimidating. I decided to head back to the main road, taking care to follow the dirt track carefully. The morning was still quiet, but the sounds of birds and insects filled the air, signaling the return of life and movement. After a slow, cautious drive, I finally reached the paved road again. From there, it wasn't long before I saw a gas station and a small diner. I stopped, filled up the tank, and bought a hot coffee that warmed my hands and my spirits. That night in the middle of nowhere wasn't scary because of ghosts or shadows. It was the real, raw experience of being isolated, far from everything familiar. It was about waiting, watching, and understanding just how quiet and empty the world could feel when you're truly alone. But it was also a reminder that no matter how far you go, or how lost you feel, there's always a way back. The road, the light, the small signs of life, they are all there. You just have to keep moving forward until you find them again. The road stretched endlessly ahead, a thin strip of cracked asphalt cutting through fields of dry grass and low shrubs. There was nothing else around for miles. Not a house, not a sign of life, just the bare, empty land that rolled out flat under a wide, pale sky. The sun hung low, beginning its slow descent behind the distant hills, casting long shadows across the ground. I was driving alone, my old pickup truck humming steadily beneath me, its engine a familiar comfort in the vast silence. I'd taken this route on a whim, wanting to get away from the noise of the city, the crowds, and the constant rush of everyday life. The plan was simple. Drive as far as I could into the middle of nowhere, find a spot to stop, and just be alone with my thoughts for a while. No distractions, no responsibilities. Just the open road and the quiet. After a couple of hours, the road started to get rougher. Potholes and cracks became more frequent. The paint on the lines faded away altogether, and eventually the asphalt ended, replaced by packed dirt and loose gravel. The tires kicked up small clouds of dust as I pressed forward, the truck's suspension rattling under the uneven ground. I glanced in the rearview mirror. The only thing behind me was the empty road disappearing into the haze. Around me, the landscape was mostly flat, interrupted only by small clusters of scraggly bushes and the occasional lone tree struggling to survive in the dry soil. The wind was soft but steady, carrying a faint smell of earth and dry grass. The sky shifted colors as the sun dipped lower, orange bleeding into pink, then fading into pale blue. Eventually, I found a spot that looked promising. It was a small clearing by the side of the dirt road, surrounded by a few weathered trees with cracked bark and sparse leaves. I pulled over, killing the engine and stepping out into the cool air. The ground was hard and dry underfoot, the grass brittle and yellow. There was no sound besides the wind and the faint rustling of leaves. I walked around the clearing, taking in the emptiness. No signs of other people or vehicles. No buildings or structures. Just raw, untouched land stretching to the horizon. It was peaceful but also a little unsettling. Being so isolated made me aware of how small I really was in this vast space. As the sun sank completely, the temperature dropped quickly. I grabbed a jacket from the back of the truck and lit a small campfire with some dry twigs and leaves I found nearby. The fire crackled and popped, sending sparks into the darkening sky. I sat close, feeling the heat on my face as the stars began to appear overhead, hundreds of tiny lights scattered across the black velvet. There was no moon tonight, so the darkness felt deep and absolute. I looked up, trying to remember the names of some constellations I'd learned as a kid. Orion's belt was clear, a straight line of 3 bright stars cutting through the sky. It was amazing to see the stars so vividly, without the city lights washing them out. The silence around me was thick, almost physical. No cars, no planes, no voices. Just the occasional crackle from the fire and the faint sound of the wind moving through the branches. I spent a long time staring at the fire, lost in thought. The solitude made everything feel sharper. Memories, worries, hopes. I thought about why I'd come out here, what I was running from, or maybe what I was looking for. There was no easy answer. The quiet forced me to face myself without distractions. Hours passed. The fire burned low, leaving glowing embers that flickered like tiny eyes in the dark. The cold crept in despite my jacket. I crawled into the back of the truck, where I'd laid out a sleeping bag and a small pillow. The mattress was old and thin, but it was better than nothing. I closed my eyes and tried to rest, but sleep was slow to come. Around midnight, I was woken by a sound, a soft crunching, like footsteps on dry leaves. My heart jumped. I sat up slowly, trying to see through the darkness beyond the truck's windows. The headlights were off, so everything outside was pitch black except for the faint glow of the dying embers. The noise stopped as suddenly as it had started. I waited, breath held, listening. Nothing. I didn't see anything when I finally forced myself to step outside and look around. The night was still and empty again, the stars watching silently. Maybe it had been an animal, a deer or a coyote moving nearby. Out here, you never really knew what might come through the brush. The rest of the night was restless. The cold seeped into the truck's cab, and I found myself shivering under the thin blanket. I kept one ear open, alert to any sounds, but the only company was the wind and the distant cry of a lone owl. When the first light of dawn broke, it painted the sky in soft pastels. Pale pinks, blues, and yellows blending slowly. The temperature warmed quickly with the sun. I climbed out, stretching stiff muscles, and took a deep breath of the fresh, clean air. The world looked new and calm in the early morning light. I started the truck and drove slowly back toward the main road, feeling a strange mix of relief and sadness. The quiet had been good, necessary even, but it also made me realize how much I depended on people and connection. Being alone for too long out here was lonely in a way I hadn't expected. On the way back, the sun climbed higher, warming the cracked earth and turning the dry grass golden. The truck's tires kicked up dust that hung in the air behind me, a visible trace marking my passage through the emptiness. When I finally reached the paved road and saw the first signs of houses and power lines, I felt a rush of normalcy wash over me. The city was loud and crowded, but it was home. The middle of nowhere had been a place to clear my head, to see myself without distractions, but it wasn't where I belonged. As I drove into the town, the smell of gasoline, food, and people hit me like a wave. I thought about the night alone under the stars and the silence that had made everything inside me feel so loud. It had been a hard night, but it was exactly what I needed. The road out here was empty and rough, but it showed me something important. No matter how far I ran, I couldn't escape myself, and maybe that was okay. I pulled into a small diner by the roadside, the kind with flickering neon signs and chipped paint on the walls. Inside, the noise of voices and clattering dishes was comforting. I ordered coffee and sat by the window, watching the world move around me. The middle of nowhere was behind me now, but the feeling of quiet stayed with me. A reminder that sometimes, stepping away was the only way to find your way back. I was driving through a stretch of land that did not feel like it belonged to anyone anymore. The road was thin, cracked, and faded to a dull gray, like it had been forgotten for years. There were no signs for towns, no billboards, no fences, and no power lines running alongside the road. Just empty land rolling out in every direction, covered with dry grass, patches of dirt, and low hills that looked the same no matter how far I drove. The sky was clear but heavy, the kind of clear that makes everything feel exposed and lonely. I had been on the road for hours already. The last gas station I passed looked half closed, with one pump working and the rest taped off. I told myself I would stop later, that the map said there was another route ahead. I trusted the map more than my gut, and that was the first mistake. The phone signal dropped slowly, one bar at a time, until there was nothing left. No service, no loading map, just the blue dot frozen on a blank screen. The road kept going, but it felt wrong. It was too quiet. No other cars passed me. No animals crossed the road. Even the wind felt still, like the air itself was holding its breath. I rolled the windows down at one point just to hear something. All I heard was the low hum of my tires and the engine working harder than it should have. That was when the car started acting up. The temperature gauge climbed faster than normal. The engine light came on and stayed on. I eased off the gas, hoping it would settle down, but it only got worse. A few minutes later, the car jerked once, then again, and then lost power. I pulled over to the side of the road, gravel crunching under the tires, and the engine died completely. I sat there for a while with my hands still on the wheel. The silence rushed in the moment the engine stopped. Felt thick and heavy, pressing against my ears. I stepped out of the car and the heat hit me hard. The sun was still high, baking the ground, and the smell of hot metal came from under the hood. When I opened it, I knew I was done. Steam drifted up slowly, and everything looked dry and worn out. I had no tools, no spare water, and no signal. I looked down the road in both directions. The road stretched straight and empty, disappearing into the heat shimmer. No buildings, no signs. Just land that looked endless and empty. I checked the trunk, then the back seat, then my pockets. Nothing helpful. I told myself someone would pass eventually. I told myself this was just bad timing, nothing more. Time moved slow out there. The sun crept across the sky, and the heat stayed constant. I tried to stay in the shade of the car, but there was not much of it. Flies started to show up, buzzing around, landing on the windows and mirrors. The wind picked up a little, carrying dust across the road in thin lines. Every sound felt louder than it should have been. After a while, I noticed something off the road, a shape that did not match the land around it. Far out past the ditch, there was an old structure sitting low against the ground. It looked like a small building or maybe a shed. The roof was crooked, and the walls looked sun-bleached and cracked. It was far enough away that I had not noticed it before. I stood there for a long time before deciding to walk toward it. Staying by the car felt pointless. There was no shade, no water, and no sign of help coming. The walk was slow and harder than it looked. The ground was uneven, full of rocks and dry holes hidden by grass. Sweat soaked through my clothes, and my mouth felt dry and sticky. Up close, the building looked worse than I expected. It was an old service shack, maybe something used decades ago when the road mattered more. One wall had collapsed inward, and the door hung open on one hinge. Inside, the air was cooler but smelled like dust, rust, and old oil. The floor was dirt, packed hard, with bits of metal and glass scattered around. I searched every corner carefully. There was nothing useful. No tools, no water, no working equipment. Just broken shelves, empty containers, and faded markings on the walls that meant nothing anymore. Still, being inside made me feel slightly safer. The sun was blocked, and the wind could not reach me as easily. As the light started to change, the place felt different. Shadows stretched longer through the broken walls. The temperature dropped just enough to notice. That was when I realized how far I was from the road. If something happened, getting back would not be easy. I stepped outside and looked toward my car. It was smaller now, sitting alone on the side of the road, surrounded by nothing. On the walk back, I felt watched, even though there was nothing around. No movement, no sound, just the feeling that the land was too open, too empty. My own footsteps sounded strange, like they did not belong out there. When I reached the car, I felt relief that surprised me. Night came fast. The sky turned deep blue, then black, filled with stars brighter than I had ever seen. With no lights around, everything stood out. The cold followed quickly. I wrapped myself in what I could find and sat inside the car, doors locked, windows up. Sleep came in short pieces, broken by discomfort and worry. Sometime early in the morning, I heard a distant sound. Not close but real. An engine. Took a moment to trust it. I got out of the car and stood on the road, watching the horizon. A faint shape appeared, growing larger slowly. Headlights cut through the darkness, bouncing as they came closer. The vehicle slowed when it reached me. It did not stop completely, but it slowed enough for the driver to see me and the dead car. A moment later, it pulled over ahead of me. Help came in the form of a tow truck that had no business being out there except routine checks. The driver helped get my car loaded and took me back toward a town that barely showed up on maps. The car was beyond repair. The mechanic later said it was a mix of heat, age, and bad luck. I was fine, just tired, dehydrated, and shaken. Days later, when I thought back on it, what stayed with me was not fear but the feeling of being small. The middle of nowhere is not empty. It is full of reminders that the world does not care if you are ready or not. I drove home in a different car, taking main roads only, and I never ignored my instincts again. I was driving through a part of the country that barely showed up on my GPS, the kind of place where the road feels forgotten and the land looks like it hasn't changed in decades. I had taken the route to save time, or at least that's what I thought at first. The highway slowly turned into a two-lane road, then into a narrow strip of cracked asphalt cutting through dry land and low hills. There were no houses, no gas stations, no billboards, nothing that made the place feel alive. Just open land, old fences leaning at bad angles, and miles of silence. The sun was already low, turning everything a dull orange. I remember noticing how quiet it was when I rolled the window down a little. No traffic noise, no wind strong enough to move the bushes, not even birds. The kind of quiet that makes you more aware of your own breathing. I kept driving because turning back would have meant losing hours, and I thought I'd be through it before dark. About 40 minutes later, my fuel warning light came on. That bothered me more than it should have. I knew I had enough gas to make it to the next town according to the GPS, but the empty land around me made that promise feel weak. I slowed down, trying to save fuel, watching the road like something might suddenly change. The road got worse. Potholes showed up without warning, forcing me to drive closer to the shoulder. The dirt on the sides looked soft, like it would swallow a tire if I drifted too far. I noticed an old dirt road branching off to the right, barely visible, with tire marks that looked recent enough to not be years old. I didn't take it. I stayed on the main road, if you could even call it that. As the light faded, my phone signal dropped to nothing. The GPS froze, the arrow stuck in place while the map stopped moving. I kept driving anyway, trusting that forward was better than stopping. That's when the car started to feel off. A vibration came through the steering wheel, small at first, then more steady. I told myself it was just the road, but deep down I knew it wasn't. A few miles later, the vibration turned into a dull thumping sound. I pulled over as far as I safely could and stepped out. The air felt heavy and still. When I checked the tire, it was almost flat, a slow leak that had probably been building for a while. The spare tire was in the trunk, but the ground was uneven and rocky. I worked anyway, hands getting dirty, sweat running down my back even though the air was cooling. Took longer than it should have. The jack kept slipping slightly, forcing me to reposition it again and again. Every time I stood up, I looked around without thinking, scanning the open land. There was nothing moving, but the darkness made the distance feel closer, like the land was watching instead of the other way around. By the time I finished, it was fully dark. The stars were bright, clearer than I'd seen in years, but that didn't help. The car started fine, which gave me some relief, and I got back on the road. I drove slower now, every sense tuned in. The fuel gauge kept dropping, and I stopped checking it after a while because it only made things worse. About 20 minutes later, the engine sputtered once. Then again. I eased off the gas, hoping it was just bad fuel movement. Then it happened a third time, stronger, and the car lost power. I coasted to the side and came to a stop. This time, when I tried to start it, nothing happened. The engine turned but didn't catch. I sat there for a moment, hands on the wheel, listening to the quiet settle in again. No headlights in the distance, no sound of engines, just the faint ticking of the car cooling down. I got out and checked under the hood even though I knew it wouldn't help. I wasn't a mechanic. Everything looked normal, which somehow made it worse. I had water and some snacks, but no signal, no idea how far the next town really was. Walking in the dark across unknown land didn't feel smart. Staying with the car felt like the only real option. I locked the doors, turned off the interior light, and waited. Time moved strangely out there. Minutes felt long, then suddenly short. I stayed awake, watching the road through the windshield. At some point, far off, I saw headlights. They were weak at first, then slowly got brighter. Relief washed over me in a way I hadn't expected. The vehicle passed by without stopping, moving fast, but knowing someone else was out there made the place feel less empty. Not long after that, another set of headlights appeared, slower this time. The vehicle pulled over ahead of me. A man stepped out, checked on the situation, and called for roadside assistance using his satellite phone. He didn't stay long, but he didn't need to. Help was on the way. Took hours, but a service truck finally arrived. My car was towed to the nearest town, which turned out to be much farther than I thought. The mechanic later told me the fuel pump had failed and the tire damage came from debris on the road. Simple problems, bad timing. I left that place the next morning after a few hours of sleep. In daylight, the land looked less threatening, just empty and worn. Still, I didn't take that road again. Being stuck in the middle of nowhere taught me how quickly normal things can turn serious when there's no one around. I made it home safe, but the memory of that silence stayed with me long after, a reminder that some roads demand more respect than they appear to at first glance. I was driving through a stretch of land that barely showed up on the map, one of those thin gray lines that looks harmless until you are actually on it. The road cut through flat, empty ground with dry grass and dirt stretching out in every direction. No houses, no fences, no power lines. Just land and sky. I had taken this route to save time, or at least that is what I told myself. The sun was already low, turning the air orange and dusty, and the wind pushed the car slightly as it moved across the open ground. The farther I went, the more alone it felt. My phone had lost signal a long time ago, and the radio was nothing but static. The road surface changed from smooth asphalt to cracked pavement and then to patches of gravel. I slowed down, feeling every bump through the steering wheel. I kept telling myself it was fine, that people drove through here all the time, even though I had not seen another car for over an hour. Then the engine light came on. At first, it was just a small yellow glow on the dashboard. I ignored it, hoping it would go away. A few minutes later, the car started to lose power. Pressing the gas did less and less. The engine sounded rough, like it was choking. I eased off the road onto a wide dirt shoulder and let the car roll to a stop. When the engine died, the sudden silence felt heavy, like the air itself had thickened. I sat there for a moment, hands still on the wheel, listening. There was no sound of traffic, no wind strong enough to move the grass. Nothing. Just a deep, empty quiet. I tried starting the car again. The engine turned over once, twice, and then nothing. The battery was still alive, but the engine was done. I got out and opened the hood, even though I knew almost nothing about cars. Heat rolled up into my face. The engine smelled burnt, sharp and oily. A thin line of smoke drifted up and vanished into the sky. Whatever had gone wrong was not something I could fix with my hands on the side of the road. I checked my phone again. No signal. Not even a single bar. Standing there, I realized how exposed I was. The land around me was wide open, but it did not feel free. It felt empty in a way that pressed in on me. The road stretched straight in both directions, disappearing into the horizon. I had passed a faded sign miles back, but I could not remember what it said or how far the next town was. I decided to wait for daylight to fade a bit more before doing anything. The heat was still strong, and I had some water in the car. I sat on the ground next to the door, watching the sky change color. As the sun went down, the temperature dropped fast. The wind picked up, making the dry grass ripple like water. Shadows grew longer, and the land started to look unfamiliar, even though nothing had changed. That was when I noticed the footprints. They were in the dirt near the edge of the road, not fresh enough to be sharp, but clear enough to see. They followed the road, heading in the same direction I had come from. They were human, adult-sized. I had not seen anyone, no parked cars, no buildings. The idea that someone had walked out here, far from everything, made my chest tighten. I told myself they could be old, maybe from days ago, maybe from someone checking a fence or a pipeline. Still, I kept looking down the road, scanning the distance. The light was fading, and the flat land made it hard to judge how far anything was. As darkness settled in, the sounds changed. Small movements in the grass became louder. Insects started buzzing. Somewhere far off, something moved through the brush, heavy enough to make noise. It could have been an animal, but the not knowing made every sound feel closer than it was. I locked myself inside the car. The inside felt smaller now, like the walls had moved in. I leaned the seat back and tried to rest, but my body stayed tense. Every time the wind shook the car slightly, my heart jumped. I checked the mirrors over and over, even though they showed nothing but darkness and my own reflection. Hours passed slowly. The stars came out, sharp and bright, filling the sky. The cold seeped in through the doors and windows. I wrapped myself in a jacket and rationed my water, taking small sips. I kept thinking about how long it would take someone to come by, and how easy it would be for nobody to come at all. Sometime in the night, I noticed something new in the dirt near the car. More footprints. These were closer, clearer. They circled the vehicle, slow and careful. My mouth went dry. I stayed perfectly still, barely breathing, listening for any sound beyond the wind. I did not hear footsteps, but that did not mean anything. Whoever made those prints did not need to be loud. Nothing happened for a long time after that. The night stretched on, and exhaustion pulled at me, but I fought it. When the sky finally started to lighten, I felt a weak sense of relief. With daylight came visibility, and with visibility came options. As soon as the sun was up enough to see clearly, I got out of the car. The footprints were there, plain in the morning light. They led away from the road and into the grass, disappearing where the ground hardened. I did not follow them. I checked the car one last time, then started walking in the direction I thought would lead to a main road. The walk was long and tiring. The land looked the same no matter how far I went. My legs ached, and my throat burned from thirst. After what felt like hours, I saw something different on the horizon. A thin line darker than the ground. As I got closer, it became clear it was a paved road, wider and in better shape. Eventually, a truck passed by. The driver noticed me and stopped. Help came after that, real help, the kind that fixes problems instead of creating new ones. My car was towed later that day, and I was taken back to a place with people, noise, and walls. Even now, when I think about that night, what stays with me is not fear of something unreal. It is the simple truth of how quickly things can go wrong when you are far from everything. The middle of nowhere is not empty. It is full of risks, silence, and the reminder that being alone is not the same as being safe. I was driving alone through a stretch of land that felt like it had been forgotten on purpose. No houses, no towns, no signs that anyone cared enough to name the place. Just long, flat road cutting through dry ground and scattered weeds. The sky was wide and pale, the kind that makes you feel small without trying. I had taken the route because my phone GPS showed it would save time, but once I was already deep into it, I realized time was not what this place cared about. The road surface changed from smooth to rough without warning. Small cracks turned into long broken lines, and then into patches where gravel showed through old asphalt. My tires made a steady hum that never changed, and that sound became the only proof that I was still moving forward. I kept checking my mirrors even though there was nothing behind me. No cars, no dust trails, no movement at all. The land on both sides looked empty at first, but the longer I drove, the more details started to stand out. Rusted fence posts leaning at odd angles, wire hanging loose and buried in dirt, old tire tracks that left the road and disappeared into nothing, dead grass flattened in strange patterns, like something heavy had been dragged across it a long time ago. There were no trees, just low bushes and rocks that looked like they had been there forever. After hours of driving, my fuel gauge dropped faster than I expected. I knew I had made a mistake trusting the map. There was no station ahead, no services, nothing. Just more road stretching forward like a thin line into heat haze. I slowed down, trying to save fuel, and that was when the engine started to feel wrong. Not loud, not dramatic, just a small change that anyone who has driven long enough learns to notice. A vibration that did not belong. The engine finally gave up without warning. No loud bang, no smoke, just silence. The kind of silence that presses against your ears. I rolled to a stop on the side of the road, gravel crunching under the tires, and then nothing. I sat there for a long time with my hands still on the wheel, staring straight ahead. The road kept going, but I wasn't. I tried my phone. No signal. Not even a weak one. The screen felt useless in my hand, just a piece of glass showing the time ticking forward. I stepped out of the car, and the heat hit harder than I expected. The air was dry and heavy, like it had been sitting still all day waiting for someone to walk into it. I opened the hood even though I am not a mechanic. Hot metal smell rose up, sharp and unpleasant. Everything looked the same as it always does to someone who doesn't know engines. Hoses, metal parts, dust. Nothing obvious. I closed it again, already knowing I wasn't fixing anything out there. I looked down the road in both directions. Nothing moved. No wind, no birds, no insects. Just empty space and the sun slowly lowering. That was when the feeling started. Not fear exactly, but awareness. The kind you get when you realize help is not close and night is coming whether you like it or not. I checked the trunk. A half-full water bottle, an old jacket, a small flashlight with weak batteries. No food. No spare fuel. I drank only a little water and forced myself to stop. I knew better than to waste it. I sat on the edge of the trunk and watched the sun slide down. The light changed color, turning the land orange, then dull brown, then gray. As it got darker, the temperature dropped fast. The heat of the day left like it had never been there. The silence changed too. It became deeper, heavier. Every small sound I made felt loud. My footsteps on gravel sounded wrong, like I was breaking some rule by being there. I stayed inside the car once it was dark. The flashlight barely helped, so I turned it off to save power. The sky above was full of stars, more than I had ever seen, but they did not make me feel calm. They made the space feel bigger and me smaller. I slept in short pieces, waking up often, unsure how much time had passed each time my eyes opened. When morning came, it didn't feel like relief. The sun came back fast, bringing heat and showing the same empty land again. Nothing had changed. My car was still dead. My phone still useless. I decided to walk. I locked the car even though I knew it didn't matter. I took the water and the jacket and started walking along the road in the direction I had been going. The road felt endless. Each rise looked like it might reveal something ahead, but every time it was just more of the same. Hours passed. My mouth dried out. My legs felt heavy. The heat pressed down again. I started noticing things I hadn't before. Old cans half buried in dirt. A broken signpost with no sign left on it. Pieces of black rubber shredded and scattered. Signs that others had passed through but not recently and not often. I began to understand something important as I walked. This place wasn't dangerous because of something hiding in it. It was dangerous because it didn't care. You could break down, get lost, run out of time, and the land would stay exactly the same. No reaction. No change. Late in the afternoon, I saw a thin line of dark shapes far ahead. At first, I thought it was another trick of light, but it stayed there as I walked closer. It was a small cluster of buildings barely standing. An old service stop or rest area that had been abandoned for years. Roofs sagging, walls faded and cracked. I reached it with shaking legs and very little water left. Inside one of the buildings, I found shade and a working hand pump outside, connected to a deep well. The water was slow and tasted metallic, but it was water. I drank carefully, resting for a long time before doing anything else. There was an old emergency radio inside, dusty but intact. After hours of trying and waiting, it finally picked up a weak signal. I stayed there until help arrived the next morning, a maintenance truck that rarely checked that road anymore. Weeks later, after everything was done and I was back in normal places with normal sounds, I still thought about that stretch of road. Not with fear, but with respect. The middle of nowhere isn't empty. It's full of reminders. Reminders that planning matters, that shortcuts can cost more than time, and that being alone isn't always loud or dramatic. Sometimes it's quiet, patient, and waiting for you to notice how small you really are. I ended up in the middle of nowhere because of a bad decision I didn't think through. I had taken a shortcut on a long drive, one of those thin lines on the map that looks harmless until you are already too far in to turn back. The paved road slowly turned rough, then broken, and then it was just dirt and gravel. Trees closed in on both sides, tall and dry, with branches that looked dead even though it was still warm outside. There were no houses, no signs, no cell signal. Just road, trees, and open land stretching out in every direction. The farther I went, the quieter it got. Not a peaceful quiet, but the kind that makes you aware of every small sound. The tires crunching on rocks sounded too loud. The engine noise felt like it was echoing even though there was nothing around. I kept driving because stopping felt worse than moving. I told myself the road had to lead somewhere. Roads don't just exist for no reason. After a while, the land opened up. The trees thinned and turned into wide, empty fields. The ground looked dry and cracked, like it hadn't seen rain in a long time. There were old fence posts leaning at strange angles, some with rusted wire still hanging from them. It felt abandoned, like people had once been there and then slowly left, one by one. The sky started to change color, fading from bright to dull as the sun lowered. That's when I realized I had been driving for hours without seeing another car. The car started to feel different. The steering wheel vibrated more than before. The road got worse, full of deep ruts and sharp stones. I slowed down, but it didn't help much. Then I felt a sudden pull to one side and heard a loud pop. The car dragged hard, and I barely managed to stop without sliding off the road. When I stepped out, the air felt heavy and dry, and the silence pressed in on me. The tire was shredded. Not just flat, but torn open like it had been sliced. I stood there longer than I should have, just staring at it. The spare was in the trunk, but when I checked it, my stomach dropped. The spare was flat too. I remembered thinking I would deal with it later, months ago, and now that small delay had followed me all the way out here. I tried my phone again, even though I already knew there was no signal. Nothing. I looked around, hoping to see some building, a tower, anything. There was nothing but open land and the road stretching forward and backward, both directions looking exactly the same. I felt very small standing there, like the land didn't care that I existed. As the light faded, the temperature dropped fast. The wind picked up and carried dust across the road. I decided to stay with the car. Walking felt risky. I had no idea how far the next place was, and getting lost out there would be worse. I gathered what I had, water bottles, some snacks, a jacket, and sat inside the car with the doors locked. even though I knew locks wouldn't matter much if something went wrong. Night came fully, and the darkness was deep. There were no lights anywhere, no glow on the horizon. The sky was full of stars, more than I had ever seen before, but instead of being calming, it made me feel exposed. Every sound stood out. The wind moving through dry grass, something small running across the ground, metal ticking as the car cooled down. I stayed awake, checking the time over and over, even though time didn't mean much out there. Sometime after midnight, I noticed tracks in the dust near the road when I stepped out to stretch. Not fresh tire tracks, but footprints. Human footprints. They weren't clear enough to tell how old they were, but they crossed the road and disappeared into the field. That bothered me more than anything else. It meant someone had been out there, walking with no clear destination. The night dragged on. I slept in short, broken pieces, waking up every time the wind shifted or the car creaked. When morning finally came, it felt like a relief just to see color again. The land looked even more empty in daylight. No houses, no roads branching off, just endless space. I decided to walk. Sitting and waiting didn't feel smart anymore. I locked the car, took water, and started down the road in the direction I hadn't come from. The sun climbed quickly, and the heat returned. My mouth went dry fast, even though I tried to pace myself. The road stretched on, rising and falling gently, never revealing anything new. After hours of walking, I saw something different ahead, a shape that didn't belong. As I got closer, it turned out to be an old structure, maybe a farm building or a storage shed. The roof was partly collapsed, and the walls were faded and cracked. Inside, there was nothing useful, just dust, broken wood, and signs that animals had moved through at some point. Still, it meant I wasn't completely alone in the world. Behind the building, there was a wider dirt road, one that looked more used than the one I had been on. Tire marks were visible, fresh enough to give me hope. I followed it, feeling tired but focused. Eventually, after what felt like another endless stretch, I heard a sound I hadn't heard in a long time. An engine, a vehicle moving. When I reached the main road, I didn't feel relief right away. I felt shaky, like my body didn't trust it yet. But cars were passing. Real traffic. I flagged one down and got help, and hours later, my car was towed and I was back in a place with buildings, lights, and noise. Even days later, the feeling stayed with me. The memory of that silence, that open land, and the way the road seemed to go on forever without caring who was on it. The middle of nowhere wasn't just a place on a map. It was a reminder of how fast things can go wrong and how small a person really is when the world decides not to offer help. I still drive, but I don't take shortcuts anymore, and I never ignore small problems, because I know exactly where they can lead. The road ran straight for so long that it stopped feeling real. It was one of those empty stretches where the land looks the same in every direction, flat and dry, with weeds bending low from constant wind. The sun was already dropping, turning the sky dull orange, and I hadn't seen another car for more than an hour. I was driving through the middle of nowhere, cutting across a rural route to save time, trusting a map that looked too clean for a road this bad. My tires hummed on cracked asphalt. The lines on the road were faded almost white, broken in places like they had given up years ago. Every few miles there was a rusted fence or an old gate leaning sideways, leading to land that looked unused and forgotten. No houses, no lights, no signs, just long stretches of nothing. I wasn't in a hurry, but I also didn't want to be out there after dark. The gas gauge was just under half, enough to get somewhere, I thought. The air inside the car smelled faintly of dust and warm plastic. I kept the window cracked because the AC wasn't working right, and the outside air felt dry and stale, like it hadn't moved all day. About 10 miles after the last turnoff, the road changed. It narrowed without warning. The surface turned rough, patched over and over again, with loose gravel pulled onto the pavement. The steering wheel started to shake slightly, and I slowed down. The land around me dipped into shallow ditches and low hills, the kind that block your view just enough to make you uneasy. That's when I noticed the fence running alongside the road had changed too. It was newer, thicker metal posts driven deep into the ground. Every few hundred feet, there were small signs attached to it. I couldn't read them at first, but I could tell they weren't old. They caught the light differently. The sun dropped lower, and the shadows stretched long across the road. My phone had no signal. I checked it anyway, out of habit. Nothing. No bars. The silence outside felt heavy, like the land itself was holding its breath. A few minutes later, the car hit something sharp. There was a loud pop, followed by a dragging sound. The steering wheel jerked, and I fought to keep the car straight. I slowed to a stop on the shoulder, heart beating hard, the sound of the flat tire obvious even before I got out. When I stepped outside, the quiet hit me even harder. No insects, no birds, just wind brushing through dry grass. The smell of hot rubber mixed with dust. The tire was completely shredded, torn open like it had been sliced. A piece of metal was stuck deep in the tread, bent and jagged, not something that looked like it came from the road by accident. I opened the trunk and checked the spare. It was there, but half flat and cracked along the side. Useless. I stood there longer than I should have, staring at it, trying to think clearly. The fence was closer now that I was outside. One of the signs was only a few steps away. I walked over and wiped dust off it with my sleeve. It warned about private property and restricted land. The paint was fresh. The bolts were tight. Someone had put effort into keeping people out. I looked up and down the road. Still nothing. No headlights. No movement. The sun finally slipped below the horizon, and the temperature dropped fast. I could feel it on my arms. Walking was the only option. I locked the car even though it felt pointless, grabbed a bottle of water, and started down the road in the direction I had been heading. The ground beside the road was uneven, full of rocks and dry weeds that scraped against my legs. Every step felt loud. As it got darker, the fence continued without end. Beyond it, the land dipped and rose, with old dirt paths cutting through it, barely visible. Some of them looked used, pressed flat by tires or heavy equipment. I noticed deep ruts in places still sharp, like they were made recently. After about 30 minutes, I saw lights ahead. Not streetlights, but a low cluster of white lights, steady and harsh. Relief washed over me at first. Then I noticed how isolated they were. No town, no other buildings. Just one compound sitting alone in the dark. As I got closer, the smell hit me. Oil, metal, and something rotten underneath it. The fence around the place was taller, topped with barbed wire. Cameras were mounted on poles, slowly turning back and forth. The ground near the gate was packed down hard, stained dark in places. I stopped walking. Everything in my body told me not to go closer. This wasn't help. This wasn't a place meant for someone like me to just wander into. That's when I heard movement behind me. Not footsteps exactly, but the sound of something shifting, metal scraping softly. I turned slowly. A vehicle was parked off the road, half hidden in a shallow ditch. It was dark, unmarked, and running. I hadn't seen it before. The headlights came on, flooding the road with light. I froze. The engine revved once, slow and controlled. There was no rush in it, just confidence. I didn't wait to see more. I stepped off the road, cutting across the ditch, my shoes sliding on loose dirt. I moved low and fast, following the fence line back the way I came. My lungs burned, and my heart felt like it was trying to break free from my chest. The lights followed the road, not me. The vehicle stayed on pavement. That was the only thing that saved me. I kept moving, using the land to hide, staying down until my legs shook. Eventually, the lights faded behind me. I didn't stop until I reached my car. The night was fully dark now. I got inside, locked the doors, and sat there breathing, afraid to move. Hours passed. I didn't sleep. I watched the road, hands tight on the wheel. Just before dawn, a pickup truck came into view. I flagged it down without thinking. The driver stopped, helped me load my car, and towed it to the nearest town without asking many questions. In the daylight, everything looked less threatening, but no less wrong. When I tried to explain where I had been, the locals avoided my eyes. One man finally told me that some roads aren't meant to be shortcuts and that some places don't want witnesses. I never went back for the car until weeks later, with help and daylight on my side. The fence was gone. The signs were gone. The road looked old again, like nothing had ever been there. But the tire was still shredded the same way, and I still remember how quiet that place was, and how deliberate everything felt. Some parts of the middle of nowhere are empty for a reason, and getting out alive doesn't always mean you were meant to see it in the first place. I was driving through a stretch of land that felt forgotten by time. The road was narrow, cracked, and barely marked, cutting through miles of dry fields and low hills. There were no houses, no stores, no lights, nothing but old fence posts and weeds bending in the wind. I had taken this route to save time, trusting the map on my phone more than my own sense. The signal had already dropped an hour back, but I kept going because turning around felt like giving up for no reason. The sky was pale and empty, the kind of color that makes everything feel flat and distant. My car was packed with basic things: a small cooler, a backpack with clothes, some tools, and a blanket. Nothing fancy. The air inside the car smelled like dust and warm plastic. The engine noise was the only sound I had for company. Every few miles I passed an old sign, faded so bad I could not read it. The land kept stretching out, and the road kept going straight like it had no end. After a while, I noticed the fuel gauge sitting lower than I expected. I did the math in my head and realized I had made a mistake earlier, thinking I had more range than I actually did. That was when the first tight feeling hit my chest. I eased my speed and hoped I would see something ahead. A station, a building, anything. The road stayed empty. No other cars passed me, not from behind and not from ahead. The engine began to feel different under my feet, a slight shake that came and went. I told myself it was just the rough road, but deep down I knew better. A few minutes later, the car started losing power. I pulled over to the side where the dirt met the broken asphalt. When the engine finally died, the silence hit hard. It was sudden and heavy, like the land itself was listening. I stepped out of the car and the heat wrapped around me. The sun was lower now, not setting yet but already softer. The wind moved through the grass, making a low, steady sound. I popped the hood even though I already knew fuel was the problem. The engine smelled hot and dry. No leaks, no smoke, just empty. I looked down the road in both directions. The same view both ways. Long, empty, quiet. I checked my phone again even though I knew there was no signal. Nothing changed. I drank some water and sat on the edge of the seat, trying to think clearly. Walking did not feel smart. I had no idea how far anything was, and the land looked bigger the longer I stared at it. As the light started to fade, the temperature dropped faster than I expected. The heat of the day left the ground, and the air turned sharp. I wrapped the blanket around my shoulders and stayed close to the car. It felt safer to stay with something solid. The sky slowly filled with stars, more than I usually see, bright and cold. The darkness made the land feel even wider. Hours passed in a strange way. Time felt stretched and loose. I listened to every sound. Wind, insects, the shifting metal of the car cooling down. At one point I noticed footprints near the edge of the road, old and half-filled with dust. They were not fresh, but they reminded me that this place was not as empty as it looked. People had been here before, even if they were gone now. Sometime during the night, I saw headlights far off in the distance. They were small and unsteady, like they were bouncing on the road. I stood up and waved my arms, my heart racing. The lights passed without slowing, disappearing into the dark like they were never there. After that, the quiet felt heavier than before. I did not sleep much. I rested in short pieces, waking up to check my surroundings again and again. When morning finally came, the light felt like relief. The land looked less threatening in daylight, but the problem was still there. No fuel, no signal, no clear plan. I checked my supplies and realized I could last another day if I was careful. Late in the morning, I noticed a thin line of dust on the horizon. It moved slowly, then stopped, then moved again. I watched it for a long time, not trusting my eyes. Eventually, the shape became clearer. A small truck, old and worn, driving slow. I stood by the road and made myself visible. The truck pulled over at a distance. The driver stayed inside for a moment before getting out. He kept his space, careful and alert, like someone used to being alone out here. He looked at my car, then at the empty fuel gauge I pointed to. He nodded once and went back to his truck. He had a spare can in the back, dusty and dented, but full enough to matter. I poured the fuel slowly, not wasting a drop. When I started the engine, the sound felt like life coming back. I did not rush. I packed my things, took one last look at the road, and got back in the car. I drove carefully, watching the gauge like it was fragile. After a long stretch, the land began to change. A few buildings appeared, then a sign that actually had words on it. When I finally reached a proper road and saw traffic again, my shoulders relaxed for the first time in a day. I filled the tank completely at the first station I saw. That place in the middle of nowhere stayed with me. Not because of anything unreal or strange, but because of how easy it was to end up there by accident. The land did not try to scare me. It did not need to. It just existed, wide and quiet, and it reminded me how small one person can be when things go wrong. I drove away with a full tank, a clear road ahead, and a strong promise to never trust shortcuts without thinking twice. I was driving through a stretch of land that did not feel like it belonged to anyone. It was one of those areas where the map shows a road, but nothing else matters. No towns, no gas stations, no names that mean anything. Just a thin line cutting through miles of dry ground and low hills. I had taken the route to save time, or at least that was what I told myself. The sun was already dropping, and the light had that dusty orange color that makes everything look tired. The road was cracked and uneven, and my tires kept humming in a steady way that slowly got under my skin. There were no other cars. Not behind me, not ahead of me. Just empty space and wind pushing against the side of my vehicle. Every few miles there would be a broken fence or an old wooden post leaning at a bad angle, like someone gave up halfway through building something and walked away forever. I remember thinking how quiet it was. Not peaceful quiet, but empty quiet. The kind where you start to hear your own breathing and the small noises your body makes. The air felt dry in my throat, and no matter how much water I drank, my mouth still felt dusty. The land around me was flat in some places and uneven in others, with shallow dips that looked like dried-out riverbeds. After a while, I noticed my fuel was lower than I expected. Not empty, but low enough to make me pay attention. I told myself it was fine. I had enough to reach the main highway later that night. Still, the thought stayed with me. I slowed down a bit, not because it helped fuel, but because slowing down made me feel like I was in control. The sun finally slipped below the horizon, and the temperature dropped fast. The sky turned a deep blue, and the stars came out sharp and bright. There were more stars than I was used to seeing, like the sky had been wiped clean. My headlights felt small compared to all that darkness. They lit up only a narrow piece of road, and everything else stayed hidden. That was when I saw something off to the side. First, it looked like a pile of junk. Then my headlights caught the shape better. It was a vehicle sitting a few yards off the road. An old pickup truck, rusted and tilted slightly, like it had sunk into the ground over time. One of the tires was completely flat, almost melted into the dirt. There were no lights, no movement, no sign of anyone around. I kept driving. I told myself there was nothing to gain by stopping. But a few miles later, my car started to feel wrong. The engine sound changed slightly, and the steering wheel vibrated more than usual. I tried to ignore it, but then a warning light came on. Not flashing, just steady and calm, which somehow made it worse. I pulled over to the side of the road where the ground looked firm enough. When I stepped out, the silence hit harder. There were no insects, no distant traffic, nothing. Just wind brushing against dry grass. The smell of dust and hot metal filled my nose. I popped the hood and stared at the engine, knowing full well I did not have the skills to fix anything serious. I checked what I could. Fluids looked low but not empty. Nothing was leaking. Still, the engine was running rough. I closed the hood and sat back inside, hoping it would smooth out after a few minutes. It did not. Instead, the engine sputtered and died, leaving me in complete darkness except for the dashboard lights fading out. I sat there longer than I should have, just listening to my own breathing. My phone had 1 bar of signal, barely enough to show the time. No calls went through. No messages sent. I tried again and again until the battery dropped faster than I liked. I thought about walking, but I had no idea how far anything was. The road felt endless, and the darkness made it worse. The old pickup truck I passed earlier came back to my mind. It did not feel like help. Felt like a warning. I decided to stay with the car. I cracked a window for air and wrapped myself in a jacket. Hours passed slowly. The cold sank into my bones, and the ground outside seemed to swallow sound. At some point, I noticed faint lights far away. Not headlights, not moving. Just a steady glow, low on the horizon. When morning came, the world looked different. Less threatening, but still empty. The land stretched out the same way with no signs of life. The light revealed tire tracks near my car that I did not remember making. They were old, half-washed by wind, but close enough to make my stomach tighten. I waited until the sun was higher, then tried the engine again. It struggled, coughed, and finally turned over. The sound felt like relief pouring into my chest. I did not waste time. I drove carefully, eyes scanning everything around me. About 20 minutes later, I reached a stretch where the road met a wider highway, a real one with fresh lines and signs. I pulled onto it and kept driving until I saw the first gas station. When I stopped, my hands were shaking as I filled the tank. I never went back to that road. I looked it up later and found almost nothing about it. No stories, no warnings, just a thin line on a map cutting through a place that does not care if you pass through or not. What stayed with me was not fear of something chasing me, but the feeling of being completely unnoticed. Like if I had stayed there longer, the land would have taken me quietly, without effort, and nothing would have changed at all. I was driving through a part of the country that did not feel like it belonged to anyone. The road was narrow, cracked, and faded so bad the lines were almost gone. Trees stood far apart, dry and twisted, like they had grown tired of being there. The sky was flat and gray, not stormy, just heavy, like it had been sitting there all day without moving. I had no cell signal for hours, and the radio only gave static no matter how much I turned the knob. I kept driving because there was nothing else to do. I was heading to a small job site that barely showed up on the map. The GPS stopped working miles back, freezing on a screen that meant nothing now. I trusted the paper map I had folded on the passenger seat, even though it looked old and worn, with coffee stains and ripped corners. Every mile felt longer than the last. No houses, no farms, no people, just open land and the sound of my tires humming on the rough road. After a while, I noticed something strange. The road had no side paths anymore. No driveways, no signs. It felt like I had passed the same dead tree twice, then 3 times. I checked the map again and slowed down, my eyes scanning the land. That was when I saw a fence line running alongside the road. The fence was broken in places, leaning inward, the wood gray and splintered. Some parts were tied together with old wire. It looked like it had been there for decades. I kept driving until my fuel light came on. That feeling in my chest tightened. I had not seen a gas station or even a building in hours. I slowed down even more, hoping to see something, anything. That was when my car started to feel wrong. The steering wheel vibrated slightly, not enough to lose control, but enough to notice. Then there was a dull thump from under the car. I pulled over to the side of the road, dust kicking up around me, and turned off the engine. The silence hit hard. No wind, no birds, no insects, just nothing. I stepped out of the car and the smell of dry dirt and hot metal filled the air. I walked around to check the tires. The rear tire was shredded, torn open like it had been cut. I looked around the ground and saw sharp metal pieces scattered near the road, half buried in dirt. Someone had put them there on purpose. That thought sat heavy in my head. I got back into the car and tried my phone again. No signal. Not even emergency. I stayed there for a few minutes, thinking. The sun was slowly lowering, turning the land orange and brown. I knew staying in the car overnight was a bad idea, but walking felt worse. Still, I could see something in the distance, far off the road. A low building, maybe a shed or a small house. It was the only thing breaking the flat land. I locked the car and started walking. The dirt was soft in some places, hard in others. My shoes picked up dust with every step. As I got closer, I could see it was an old structure, made of concrete blocks, with a metal door hanging crooked on its hinges. No windows. The roof had rusted patches, and parts of it sagged inward. It looked abandoned, but not completely forgotten. Around the building, the ground was disturbed. Tire marks, footprints, some old, some newer. That made my stomach twist. I walked slowly, circling the place. The door was slightly open. I did not touch it at first. I listened. Still nothing. I pushed it open and stepped inside. The smell was awful. Rot oil and something sour. The inside was dark, but light slipped in through holes in the roof. The floor was stained with dark marks that looked old. There were tools scattered around, some broken, some clean like they were still being used. Against one wall were stacks of empty water bottles and food cans. Someone had been staying here. I moved deeper inside and noticed something else. Chains bolted into the concrete floor. Thick ones. Some were loose, others pulled tight like they had been used recently. I backed away, my heart pounding. This was not just some random shed. This place was wrong. I turned to leave, but then I saw movement outside. Dust rising. A vehicle far off, moving slowly toward the building. Panic took over. I had no weapon, no phone, no car. I looked around and saw a narrow door at the back, barely noticeable. I slipped through it and found myself behind the building, where the land dipped downward into a dry wash filled with tall weeds. I ran. The weeds scratched my arms and legs. The ground was uneven, and I stumbled more than once. I kept going, not looking back, my lungs burning. The wash curved and dropped lower, hiding me from view. I crouched there, pressing myself into the dirt, barely breathing. After a long time, I heard the engine stop. Doors opened and closed. Heavy footsteps on dirt. I stayed still, every muscle tense. Minutes passed, then more. Eventually, the sounds faded. The engine started again and drove off in the opposite direction. I stayed there until the sky went dark. When I finally moved, my body ached and my clothes were torn and filthy. I followed the wash until it led back toward the road, far from where my car was. I walked for hours in the dark, guided by the faint shape of the road against the land. Near early morning, I saw headlights. A real road, a highway. I flagged down the first truck I saw. I did not explain everything, just enough to get help. Later, the police went back to where my car was. They found the metal pieces on the road and the building, but no people. The place was cleared out fast, like someone knew when to leave. My car was towed, my tire replaced, and I was sent on my way. That part of the map was later marked as private land, restricted access. No explanation given. I still think about that place sometimes, about how empty it looked and how it was not empty at all. I know now that the middle of nowhere is not always empty. Sometimes it is just where no one is supposed to survive. I was driving through a stretch of land that felt forgotten by time, the kind of place where the road keeps going straight for so long that your eyes start to hurt from staring at nothing. It was late afternoon, the sun low and dull, not bright enough to feel warm, just hanging there like it had no energy left. I had taken this route because it looked shorter on the map, and I trusted the map more than my gut. That was my first mistake. The land around me was flat but rough, dry grass mixed with patches of dirt and small rocks. Every few miles there were broken fences leaning at odd angles, like someone had given up fixing them years ago. No houses, no gas stations, no signs. just the sound of my tires on the road and the wind pushing against the side of the car. I kept checking the fuel gauge even though I had filled up earlier. Out there, even a half tank can make you nervous. After a while, the road turned from clean asphalt into cracked pavement. Then it got worse. Long lines of broken blacktop ran across it like scars. I slowed down without really thinking about it. The silence out there was heavy. No birds, no insects, nothing. Just wind and the engine. It felt like the kind of place where if something went wrong, it would stay wrong for a long time. About an hour later, the signal on my phone disappeared. I wasn't using it, but seeing that empty screen still bothered me. I told myself it was fine. People drove through places like this all the time. Still, I started to feel watched, not in a scary way, but in a lonely way, like the land itself was paying attention to the one thing moving through it. Then the car started acting strange. It wasn't dramatic at first. A slight pull to the right, then a soft grinding sound when I pressed the brakes. I tried to ignore it. A few miles later, the grinding got louder. The steering wheel shook a little in my hands. I slowed down more, hoping I could make it to wherever the road led next. I never did. The car jolted hard, and I felt the back end drop. I pulled over as carefully as I could. When I got out, the heat hit me right away. The sun was still up, but it felt weaker now, like it was already thinking about leaving. The smell of hot metal and rubber filled the air. One of the rear tires was shredded. Not flat, not leaking, completely torn apart. I stood there for a long time, hands on my hips, staring at it. I had a spare, but the ground was uneven and covered in loose gravel. It took effort just to keep my balance. When I opened the trunk, I noticed how quiet everything was again. No distant traffic. No wind now. Just me and the car. Changing the tire took longer than it should have. The jack kept sinking into the dirt. Sweat ran down my face and into my eyes. My arms started shaking from the effort. I kept looking around even though there was nothing to see. Just open land in every direction and the road stretching empty behind and ahead of me. By the time I finished, the sun was close to the horizon. I packed everything up fast and got back in the car. When I started driving again, the car felt wrong. It moved, but not smoothly. Every small bump felt bigger than it should have. I kept going because stopping again wasn't an option I wanted to think about. The light faded faster than I expected. The sky turned orange, then gray, then deep blue. My headlights cut through the darkness, but they didn't reach far. The road seemed narrower at night, like it was shrinking. I passed an old dirt turnoff that looked like it hadn't been used in years. A wooden sign stood beside it, but it was too worn to read. That was when the engine light came on. A small thing, but out there it felt huge. I eased off the gas, listening closely to every sound. The engine started to cough, then settled, then coughed again. My mouth went dry. I kept driving, counting the seconds, the miles, hoping for anything ahead. The car finally died without warning. One moment I was moving, the next I was coasting in silence. I guided it to the side of the road and let it roll to a stop. When I tried the ignition again, nothing happened. No click, no turn, just dead. I sat there for a while, hands on the wheel, breathing slow. The darkness outside felt thick. When I stepped out, the night air was cooler but still dry. The stars were bright, more than I had ever seen before. It would have been beautiful anywhere else. I checked under the hood even though I didn't really know what I was looking for. Everything smelled burnt. I closed it and leaned against the car. Walking was the only choice left. I grabbed a flashlight and a bottle of water and locked the doors out of habit. The road felt different on foot. Every step echoed in my head. The beam of the flashlight bounced over cracks, stones, and dry weeds pushing through the edges. I walked for what felt like hours, but it was probably less. My legs grew tired, and my throat got dry fast. I kept thinking about how far I had already driven and how much farther I might have to go. Eventually, I saw a faint glow ahead. Not bright, just a soft yellow light. As I got closer, I realized it was a small building set back from the road. An old service station, long closed, but one light was still on inside. The windows were dusty, and the paint was peeling. The door was unlocked. Inside, the place smelled like oil and old wood. Shelves were mostly empty, but there was a phone mounted on the wall. I picked it up, not expecting much. To my surprise, there was a dial tone. Took a few tries, but the call went through. Help was on the way. Not fast, but coming. I sat on the floor and waited. The hours passed slowly. My body cooled down, then got stiff. When headlights finally appeared through the window, relief washed over me so hard it almost hurt. The tow truck driver loaded my car without rushing. Everything felt calm again, normal. By the time I was back on a main road, the sky was starting to lighten. My car was damaged but fixable. I was tired, dirty, and sore, but I was safe. As the sun came up, the middle of nowhere faded behind me, turning back into just land on a map. I didn't feel brave or proud. I felt lucky, and I knew I wouldn't take roads like that lightly again. I took that drive because I needed distance from everything I knew. It was not for adventure or fun. I had days off, a full tank, and a map with a thin road cutting through a wide empty area. I told myself it would be quiet, that nothing would happen, that it was just another drive. That was the lie I kept repeating as the towns disappeared and the land flattened into open dirt, dry grass, and long stretches of nothing. The road turned from clean asphalt into cracked pavement, then into patched sections where old repairs showed through like scars. There were no houses, no fences, no power lines for long stretches. Just land that looked unused and forgotten. The sky was wide and pale blue, and the sun felt closer than usual, heavy and bright. My phone lost signal earlier than I expected, but I did not care at first. I liked the silence. The engine sound became the only thing breaking it. After hours of driving, I realized how far I was from anything familiar. I passed a rusted sign that had no writing left on it, just holes where bolts used to be. That sign bothered me more than it should have. It meant someone once cared enough to put it there, and now no one did. The road kept going straight and narrow, with dirt shoulders that dropped into dry ditches. I slowed down without knowing why. The car started acting strange about 20 minutes later. The temperature gauge climbed higher than normal. I turned off the air and rolled the windows down, letting hot air rush in. It smelled like dust and dry plants. I told myself I could make it to the next town, even though I had not seen a sign for one in a long time. The engine made a sharp sound, then another, then lost power. I eased to the side of the road and stopped. When the car shut off, the silence felt heavy. No wind, no insects, no distant traffic. Just open land and heat. I stepped out and felt the ground radiating warmth through my shoes. The hood was hot to the touch, and when I opened it, a wave of heat hit my face. I did not know much about engines, but I knew this was not something I could fix out there. A hose looked cracked, and there was dried residue around it. I closed the hood and stood there, hands on my hips, looking in every direction like that would change something. There was nothing around me. No buildings, no trees tall enough to give shade, no other cars. The road stretched empty both ways. The sun moved slowly, but I felt time dragging harder than it should. I sat back in the car with the doors open, trying to keep cool. I checked my phone again, even though I already knew there was no signal. The battery dropped faster than I liked, so I turned it off. As the hours passed, the heat became less sharp but more exhausting. My mouth felt dry even though I had water. I took small sips, knowing I did not know how long I would be there. I watched the shadows stretch across the road, and that was when the fear started to settle in. Not panic, not sudden terror, just a slow understanding that I was alone in a place where no one was coming anytime soon. I walked a short distance down the road to see if I could spot anything I missed. The land looked the same in every direction. Dirt, rocks, low plants, and distant hills that never seemed closer. I went back to the car and waited. I tried starting it once more, and it failed the same way. The sound of the engine dying felt final. When the sun started to go down, the temperature dropped fast. The heat left the ground, replaced by a cold that felt sharp after the long day. The sky turned orange, then red, then dark blue. The The silence changed too. Felt deeper, like the land itself was holding its breath. I stayed inside the car, doors closed now, using it as shelter. I wrapped myself in the thin jacket I had brought without thinking I would need it. Night out there felt different than anywhere else I had been. The stars were brighter than I had ever seen, filling the sky from edge to edge. It should have been beautiful, but it made me feel small and exposed. Every small sound made me tense. The wind moved through the dry plants, making them scrape and whisper against each other. I stayed still, listening, counting my breaths, waiting for morning. Sleep came in short pieces. I woke up often, stiff and cold, checking the dark shapes outside the windows. Nothing moved, but my mind kept filling the emptiness with worry. When the sky finally started to lighten, I felt relief so strong it surprised me. The cold faded, replaced by early warmth. Morning made the place look less threatening, but no less empty. I stepped out of the car and stretched, my body sore. The road looked the same as the day before. I ate a small amount of food and drank water carefully. I decided I could not just wait anymore. I walked down the road again, farther this time, scanning the distance. After a long while, I saw a faint shape on the horizon. It looked like a structure low and dark against the land. I walked toward it, slow and steady, feeling the distance with every step. It turned out to be an old service shed, half collapsed, with rusted metal and broken concrete. There was no power, no phone, nothing useful inside except shade. But near it, I found a narrow dirt track leading off the road. The tracks in the dirt looked newer than anything else around. That meant vehicles still used it sometimes. I went back to the car and waited near that turnoff, standing where I could be seen. Hours passed again, but eventually, in the distance, I saw dust rising. A vehicle approached slowly, growing clearer as it came closer. I stayed visible, still, not waving wildly, just present. The vehicle slowed when it reached me. Help did not come fast or easy, but it came. The car was towed later that day, and I was taken back towards civilization, mile by mile, the empty land falling away behind me. The road turned solid again, signs appeared, and my phone regained signal like nothing had happened. When I finally reached a town and sat somewhere safe, I realized how close I had been to being truly stuck. Not lost in a dramatic way, not chased or attacked, just forgotten by distance and silence. The middle of nowhere did not try to hurt me. It did not need to. It simply existed without caring whether I did or not. I left with my car repaired days later, but I did not take that road again. Some places do not need a warning sign. Being there once was enough. I was driving through a stretch of land that felt forgotten by time. No towns, no lights, no signs that anyone lived nearby. Just a two-lane road cutting through dry land and low hills, the kind of place where the sky feels bigger than everything else. I had taken this route to save time, or at least that is what the map said. The sun was already dropping low, turning the land orange and dull brown. I remember thinking I should have filled up the tank earlier, but I kept going anyway. The road surface was rough, cracked in places, patched so many times it looked like a scarred face. My car rattled constantly, and every small bump felt louder out there because there was no other sound. No traffic, no wind, no animals. Just the engine and the tires on dry pavement. I kept checking my mirrors even though there was nothing behind me for miles. Out there, silence feels heavy, like it presses against your head. After a while, the fuel light came on. I slowed down, hoping to spot a gas station or even a small building, but there was nothing. Just fences running along empty fields, some broken, some leaning. Old wooden posts, sun-bleached and cracked. The land looked used up like it had been worked hard years ago and then abandoned. I could see old dirt paths cutting away from the road, leading to nowhere I could see. The sun finally went down, and the dark came fast. No slow sunset glow, just light fading into black. My headlights felt weak, like they could not push the darkness back far enough. That was when the engine started to lose power. Small jerks at first, then longer ones. I tried to stay calm, kept my foot steady, but I already knew how this would end. The car rolled to a stop on the side of the road. The engine died with a dry, final sound. I sat there for a few seconds, hands still on the wheel, listening. There was nothing, not even insects. I turned the key again, but it only clicked. The fuel gauge sat low and unmoving. I shut everything off to save the battery and stepped out of the car. The air was cooler than I expected. Dry, but cold enough to raise goosebumps on my arms. The smell of dust and old grass hung in the air. When I closed the car door, the sound felt too loud, like I had slammed it in a quiet room. I looked up and saw a sky full of stars, more than I had ever seen before. Beautiful, but it did not make me feel better. It made me feel smaller. I checked my phone. No signal. Not even one bar. I tried again, turning airplane mode on and off, moving the phone around like that would help. Nothing. The road stretched empty in both directions. I thought about staying in the car, but the thought of sitting there all night made my chest feel tight. I grabbed a flashlight from the trunk and started walking down the road in the direction I had been heading, hoping there might be something ahead. Every step felt loud. Gravel crunching under my shoes echoed too much. My flashlight beam cut through the dark, catching pieces of the road, weeds, and the edges of fences. Once in a while, I saw old trash half buried in dirt, rusted cans, scraps of metal. Signs that people had been here before a long time ago. That almost made it worse. It meant people had left. After maybe an hour of walking, my legs started to feel heavy. The road curved slightly, and that was when I saw it. A shape ahead, darker than the dark around it. A building, just one. Low and wide, with a roof that sagged in the middle. As I got closer, I saw it was an old roadside service station. The pumps were still there, but they looked ancient, paint peeling, hoses hanging loose like dead vines. I walked around carefully, shining my light through dirty windows. Inside, shelves were empty and covered in dust. The floor was littered with broken glass and old papers. A calendar on the wall was stuck on a date from over 10 years ago. I tried the door, and it opened with a long, tired creak. The smell inside was stale and thick, like oil and mold. I did not find fuel, but I did find a working landline phone behind the counter. I did not expect it to work, but when I picked it up, I heard a dial tone. That sound alone made my shoulders drop. I called emergency roadside services and explained where I was as best as I could. It took time, using landmarks and mile estimates, but eventually they said someone would come. I waited inside the building. I did not sit. I stayed standing, moving slowly, listening. The building made small noises as it cooled, pops and cracks in the walls and roof. The dark outside pressed against the windows. I kept checking the road through the glass, counting minutes by my breathing. Hours later, headlights finally appeared, sweeping across the front of the station. A tow truck pulled up, loud and solid, like something real returning to the world. The driver checked my car, confirmed it was empty of fuel, and gave me enough gas to reach the next town. I watched him leave before I locked up the station as best as I could and walked back to my car. Driving away, I did not speed. I stayed steady, focused, eyes locked on the road ahead. When I finally reached a town with lights and people and noise, I pulled over and sat there for a long time. The middle of nowhere stayed with me. Not because something happened, but because nothing did, and out there, that nothing feels endless. I was driving through a part of the country that didn't even feel like it belonged to anyone anymore. No towns, no houses, no lights. Just land that kept going and going. Flat in some places, broken and rough in others. I had taken the road because it was supposed to save time. On the map it looked simple, just a long line cutting through empty space. In real life it felt like a mistake the longer I stayed on it. The day had already been long before I even reached that road. I had been awake since early morning, running on gas station coffee and a couple of snacks I grabbed without thinking. My body felt heavy, like it was lagging behind my thoughts. The sun was dropping low, turning everything orange and dusty, and I remember thinking I should have stopped earlier, but there was nothing around that looked like a safe place to stop. No rest areas, no stores, not even a wide shoulder. Just fence lines, dry grass, and distant hills that never seemed to get closer. The road itself was in bad shape. Cracks ran across it like veins. Every few miles there were patches where the asphalt changed color, like someone had tried to fix it years ago and gave up. My tires hummed constantly, and that sound started to feel louder as everything else stayed quiet. No other cars passed me. I didn't see headlights in my mirrors or ahead of me. Felt like I was the only person left out there. As the light faded, the feeling changed. During the day, empty land can feel calm. At night, it feels like pressure. The sky turned dark fast, and once the sun was gone, there was nothing but my headlights cutting into the road. They showed me only what was right in front of me, and everything else disappeared. I slowed down without really meaning to. My hands were tight on the wheel, and my shoulders ached from being tense for so long. Then the car started to feel wrong. Not broken exactly, just off. The engine sound changed slightly, like it was struggling to keep steady. I checked the dash, but no warning lights came on. I told myself it was probably the road or my imagination, but I eased off the gas anyway. A few minutes later, the engine lost power for a second, then came back. That was enough to make my stomach sink. I kept going, hoping to reach anything that looked like a place where people existed. Instead, the engine sputtered again, worse this time, and then it died completely. The car rolled forward in silence except for the sound of gravel under the tires as I guided it onto the shoulder. When it stopped, the quiet felt unreal. I tried the key again, but the engine just turned weakly and then gave up. I sat there for a while with the headlights still on, staring at the road ahead. The dark beyond the light felt thick, like it had weight. I checked my phone and saw I had no signal at all. Not even a weak one. I turned the phone off to save battery. Stepping out of the car felt like crossing a line. The air was cold and dry, and it smelled like dirt and plants that had baked all day in the sun. I popped the hood and looked inside even though I didn't really know what I was looking for. Everything looked normal to me, just metal and hoses and darkness beyond the engine bay. I closed it and leaned against the car, listening. No wind, no insects, no distant traffic. Just my own breathing and the ticking sound of the engine cooling down. I thought about staying in the car until morning. Felt safer than wandering around in the dark. I locked the doors, turned off the headlights to save the battery, and sat there with nothing but the faint glow of the dash. Time moved strangely. Minutes felt long, and my thoughts kept circling the same worries. What if no one came? What if the car didn't start at all? What if I was farther from help than I thought? Hours passed, or at least it felt like hours. At some point, I saw lights far off in the distance. They were low and steady, not flickering like stars. I turned the car lights back on and waited, watching them slowly get closer. Eventually, a truck appeared on the road, its headlights bright and almost painful to look at after so much darkness. It slowed down as it passed me, then pulled over ahead. The driver checked my car and helped me figure out that a hose had come loose. It was a simple problem, the kind that becomes a big one when you're stuck in the wrong place. With the hose secured, the engine started right up. The sound felt like relief more than noise. I thanked the driver silently in my head as they drove off, leaving me alone again but no longer helpless. I didn't waste time after that. I got back on the road and kept going, more careful now, more aware of how small mistakes can turn serious when you're far from everything. Eventually, I reached a stretch where the land changed, and I saw the first sign of life in hours. A distant glow on the horizon, then a real road sign, then buildings. When I finally stopped at a place with lights and people, my body felt like it had been holding tension all night and was just now letting it go. The middle of nowhere stayed behind me, quiet and unchanged, like it hadn't noticed me at all. I knew I would remember that stretch of road for a long time, not because something impossible happened, but because nothing did, and that was enough. It was the kind of place that makes you feel small. Wide open spaces stretched in every direction, nothing but dry grass and patches of dirt, broken by occasional clusters of pine trees and the distant outline of low hills. I had driven for hours on a dusty, narrow road that cut through this middle-of-nowhere land. No towns, no gas stations, no signs of life except the wind brushing across the fields. The sun was low, close to setting, casting long shadows and turning the sky a soft orange. The silence was thick, only broken by the occasional chirp of a bird or the distant rustling of leaves. I wasn't expecting much when I came here, just a break from the noise of the city and a chance to clear my head. The plan was simple: find a quiet spot, park the truck, maybe take a walk before night fell, and then sleep under the stars. I wasn't carrying much, just a small backpack with water, some snacks, a flashlight, and a thin blanket. No fancy camping gear, no tent. I wanted to keep it simple, raw, and real, the kind of escape where you really disconnect. After driving another 20 minutes, I spotted a clearing beside the road with an old wooden fence half fallen over. It looked like someone once kept horses or cattle here, but it had been abandoned for years. The grass was tall and wild, bending slightly in the breeze. I pulled over, turned off the engine, and stepped out. The air smelled fresh but dry, with that clean, earthy scent you only get away from towns and roads. No cars, no people, no city sounds, just the wind and the quiet. I took my backpack and started walking along a narrow path that ran through the field, following the faint trail of flattened grass. The light was fading fast, and the chill of evening crept in as the sun dipped below the horizon. The sky turned darker, with stars beginning to peek out. Felt peaceful but also strange. I was alone in the middle of nowhere with no idea if anyone would pass by for miles. As I walked, I noticed signs of old life scattered around. Rusty nails sticking out of broken wood, scraps of barbed wire tangled in the brush, and a few old cans crushed flat and left forgotten. It told a story of people who had once been here but left long ago. I found an old well near the edge of the clearing, covered with a wooden board rotting at the edges. The well looked deep, and I guessed it hadn't been used in years. The silence made it feel eerie, but I wasn't afraid. It was just the kind of quiet that hits you when there's nothing else around. After a while, I stopped and sat on a fallen log, pulling out my water bottle. I drank slowly, enjoying the coolness. The sky was fully dark now, filled with stars so bright they seemed close enough to touch. The Milky Way stretched like a pale river overhead. The world felt different here, stripped of distractions and noise. I could hear the faint rustling of small animals in the grass and the distant hoot of an owl. The cold air crept into my bones, and I pulled my jacket tighter. I knew I had to find a place to sleep soon. No tents or cabins around, so I chose a small patch of flattened grass near some trees. I spread my thin blanket on the ground and lay down, staring up at the stars. The ground was hard, but it was quiet and still. I felt oddly safe out here, even with no one else around. There was something honest about this kind of loneliness, not the scary kind, but the kind that forces you to face yourself without distractions. Hours passed. The cold deepened, and the wind picked up, whispering through the trees. I wrapped the blanket tighter and thought about how far I was from the nearest town. How different this was from my usual life. No phone signal, no internet, no one to call if something went wrong. Just me, the stars, and the land. I realized I hadn't felt this disconnected in a long time, and strangely, that was exactly what I needed. Morning came slow. The first light crept over the horizon, turning the sky pale blue and pink. I woke stiff and cold but rested in a way I hadn't been for months. The world around me looked different in the morning light, less mysterious and more alive. Birds sang from the trees, and the sun warmed the earth. I packed my things slowly and started walking back to the truck, following the path I'd taken the night before. When I got back, the truck looked the same, dusty and parked under the open sky. I climbed in, started the engine, and looked around one last time. The place was empty, silent, but it had left a mark on me. I drove off slowly, the road stretching ahead under the rising sun. I felt calm, like a weight had lifted, and the noise of the city seemed far away already. That day in the middle of nowhere didn't change my life in a dramatic way. No big events, no miracles. But it reminded me what it felt like to be alone with nothing but the earth and sky. It made me realize how often we drown in distractions and forget to listen to the quiet. Sometimes you have to go to a place where nothing is happening to find what's really inside you. The truck's engine hummed steadily as I left the clearing behind, and I promised myself I wouldn't wait so long before coming back. The middle of nowhere was exactly what I needed: simple, real, and untouched. A reminder that peace can be found where no one else is, if you just let yourself be still enough to see it.